social justice narratives that the show is hurting. Like, you can see this photo here. We've got a pregnant man. The first female Time Lord's debut last month attracted an average audience of 8.2 million, but that plunged to 6.1 million on Sunday. And look, I want to point out, that's like normal for most shows, you know? When a show debuts, a ton of people want to see it, and the people who don't like it just don't come back. Fans have voiced their outrage at the new episodes, claiming the BBC are trying too hard to be PC. Fans complained of being bombarded by preachy, serious messages instead of sci-fi entertainment. Producers under new boss Chris Chibnall have opted to tackle issues such as racism as Jodie, 36, traveled back to meet civil rights icon Rosa Parks in the US in 1955. That's kind of weird, right? I remember I watched one episode. I've seen a ton of Doctor Who, but there's one episode where, like, they go to a planet where nanobots are killing people and leaving behind just dust and bones and using their flesh, like, to grow plants or something. And basically the plot of the story was that if you weren't happy, then, like, if you were sad, these robots viewed sadness as a contagion, because if you were sad, you'd make other people sad. So they started just killing anybody who was sad. You see what that story's about? It's just about this interesting idea that emotions can travel from person to person, that if you're sad, someone else might become sad. That's the kind of episode. There have been other episodes that have had messages, for sure. But now when you hear that they're going back in time to tackle, like, to meet Rosa Parks, it's kind of a head-scratcher. What? Next week, they have British imperialism in their sights. In 1947 India. What? I don't know, man. Like, what's some other episodes? Like, off the top of my head, the one I can think about is the unhappiness. But a lot of the episodes are specifically about, like, it's sci-fi. You know, one episode is there's a ship that the Doctor goes into, and there's like a mirror, and whenever there's a time difference on one side of the mirror. When he looks in, he sees a little girl's bedroom, and then every few minutes he looks back, and she's like older and older and older, and then eventually they go on an adventure together. Like, yeah, it's very sci-fi, very fantasy, very entertainment. Why they're exploring pregnant man giving birth, Rosa Parks in India, it just seems like the show's very different. And you know, like, I'm going to be critical of the Sun's use of this image here. It's like a really bad screen grab. They're really trying to smear Doctor Who, in my opinion. I do think the new season is kind of weird, but Jodie Whittaker is the first ever female Time Lord. But the BBC have gone to extreme lengths to ensure the new series is as inclusive as possible. So here's what we have. The first episode was The Woman Who Fell to Earth. That's from the latest season. 8.2 million viewers. And The Ghost Monument. Notice I don't think they bring that one up. 7.1 million. Then they have Rosa Parks, and that fell to 6 million. Arachnids in the UK, 6.4 million. And the Suranga Conundrum down to 6.1 million, and that's the pregnant man episode. A viewer tweeted, "That's the last episode I'll be watching. I don't watch this type of TV show to get subliminal PC lectures. It's supposed to be entertainment." The BBC hoped to boost ratings, which slumped under Jodie's predecessor, Peter Capaldi, but they dipped to 5.9 million in parts of Sunday's episode. The Beeb had high hopes of boosting the flagging viewers' figures of Doctor Who when Peter Capaldi, 59, had the role. This year, the corporation even moved the show from Saturday to Sunday nights in the hope it might attract more viewers. Listen, when I was a kid, I used to watch shows with moral lessons. One of my favorite shows ever was Static Shock. Static Shock was awesome because they dealt with social issues, and it was a kids' show, but they did it right. Like, a lot of people have said Static Shock is social justice done right, where they don't beat you over the head, they don't accuse you of being the monster for being white or being a male, they just point out how people feel, right? So the main character, Virgil, he's a young black teenager. He gets pushed into, like, a gang, he's peer pressured into some gang fight, and there's like a chemical explosion, everybody gets superpowers, and then he decides to become a superhero, and a lot of people decide to become supervillains because they're like, they were criminals and gangs and stuff. And it deals with issues of racism, like he goes to his friend's house, and his friend's dad is racist, and you can empathize with the main character when you see this racist guy saying mean things about him. You're like, hey man, that's not cool. Virgil's a cool dude. He's a hero. He's a superhero. And then you have another episode where his friend turns out to be gay, and like how they deal with that. And it makes you empathize without beating you over the head. They don't say you're the bad guy. They say, you're a friend. You're someone who can empathize with this. But here's the point. They did that right. I'm not saying Doctor Who is doing it wrong. I'm saying, why the hell is a show for adults trying to do childlike lectures? This kind of stuff about, like, Rosa Parks, it's for kids, man. Like, you do this stuff for kids. Adults want to watch things that are... God, this photo is so awful. Come on, man. Come on, the sun. That's a terrible photo. As an adult, I think I would like to watch a show with cool ideas that ask interesting questions. What I like about Doctor Who is that they have these various sci-fi scenarios that are just rather interesting. You know, I'm a much bigger fan of Star Trek. The reason I like Star Trek The Next Generation so much is that it deals with the philosophical consequences of technology, of technological advancement, and of different cultures and how different cultures can interact. And they use Star Trek uses the sci-fi aspect, the ability to travel to different planets, as a way to present different cultures and different technologies and how they would interact with our ideas. It's fascinating. Like, one episode is they have a trial over whether or not an android is actually a sentient life form who has rights. And, you know, Captain Picard argues that, you know, who are we to determine who is and isn't alive? If they assert their sentience, then we must respect it for these reasons. It's brilliant. And Doctor Who has a lot of similar elements. But I don't want to watch Doctor Who to learn about a man being pregnant or to see them go back in time and deal with, you know, Rosa Parks or whatever. Now, more importantly, I think this Sun article is really pushing it because they mentioned that Peter Capaldi's ratings dipped. They didn't mention his ratings were also around like 5 or 6 million. So this actually looks like it's kind of an improvement. In my opinion, look, is it fair to criticize Doctor Who? Sure, for sure. Seems like a different show. Like, I gotta admit, man, I'm never gonna watch an episode about Rosa Parks, right? I'm never gonna watch the Pregnant Man episode. Like, I just don't even understand how that makes sense. Are they going to give him a C-section? Like, men are ill-equipped to, like, men don't have birth canals, right? So I'd be curious as to how they did the episode. I also have no interest in watching preachy lecture political ideology shows. One rule that I always have is that whenever somebody wants to get involved in the culture war, I count myself out. Not interested. I'm not interested in your weird political arguments, your weird political debate. Here I am talking about it. But I just look. You know what, Doctor Who? That's really cool. Like, here's what I say to people. That's really cool that you're doing your show. It's really cool for Jodie Whittaker that she gets to be the Doctor. That's fine. I'd actually be interested in watching Doctor Who with Jodie Whittaker if I wasn't hearing about these weird, like, going back to Rosa Parks. What? I watched, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I watched an episode where, like, they opened a portal into a pocket time dimension where they unleashed a bunch of Time Lords, and there's like an intergalactic war, and you know what I mean? Like, robots killing people with nanotechnology because they're unhappy is very, very different from going back in time to learn a lesson about Rosa Parks, of which I'm sure they got wrong anyway because it's extremely complicated history. But I will say the Sun seems to be just kind of anti-Doctor at the moment. I actually haven't watched any of Jodie Whittaker's Doctor Who stuff. They say the new series has seen a downfall in viewing figures since the first episode, losing nearly 2 million watchers. But I think it's important to point out, as I kind of did already, that's pretty normal for most shows. My understanding is that although it's dipped down to 5.9, it's kind of on par with where it was last season. So I wouldn't say it's, like, doing really bad. Here's what I can say. Has it become a preachy social justice kind of show? I mean, it does kind of look that way. Admittedly, I haven't watched any of the new season, but I haven't because I've been hearing about this kind of stuff. It kind of puts me off and I don't want to watch it. It's possible then that maybe the ratings are where they are because people like me aren't interested in watching an episode about a pregnant man or Rosa Parks or going back to 1947 India to deal with British imperialism. I just don't find it interesting to have a time-traveling, you know, shape-shifting type, you know, omnipotent type being or whatever go back to Earth history to teach me lessons about history. Like, I'd rather see them go to a planet full of, like, giant green blob creatures that eat each other or something fun and science fiction-y. Like, you know, this just doesn't seem like fun to me at all. So maybe, but at the same time, if they are losing viewers, maybe they're gaining a different type of viewer. I think one of the reasons we see a lot of this political correct social justice content transformation among all of these different, you know, mediums is that companies are expecting a demographic change. Right, they're watching it. The white demographic in various countries are not reproducing nearly as fast as minority demographics. And so these companies are probably trying to get in front of that so they can say, hey, look, we're diverse, we're social justice. But I gotta admit, I think even among the Latino community, the black community, the Asian community, They're less concerned about you waving your little finger at them claiming to be in favor of diversity as they are just also looking for interesting content, right? I don't think the fact that someone is white or not determines whether or not they're going to want to watch a show. I just want interesting episodes. I don't want you to preach. I want to see robots shoot laser beams and fly around and travel through time. Is that too much to ask? I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the sun's biased, but it is what it is. I'm going to get out of here. You can catch me on my main channel, youtube.com/timcast, tomorrow at 4 p.m., and I'll see you then. CNN has announced it is suing Donald Trump and several White House aides over revoking Jim Acosta's press pass. And this stems from that famous moment not too long ago where Jim Acosta refused to give up the microphone to the intern who was trying to take it away. Some people say she yanked it from him, others say that he tried using his left arm to push her away, and I am of the opinion Jim Acosta did try pushing her away with his left arm, and the reason why I believe this is that you can see her get pulled off balance. But this video is not about rehashing that debate. This video is about the lawsuit and whether or not there's merit to it. Now, on a surface level, I personally believe Jim Acosta should be removed from these briefings. He should have his press pass revoked. Because it's not just this one incident where he stands up and talks for nearly 3 minutes arguing with Trump. It's that over the past couple of years, he has been called out repeatedly. MSNBC called him out. Washington Post called him out. The Atlantic called him out. When other journalists are saying what he is doing is wrong and it's dangerous, I think it's fair to say Jim Acosta either needs to stop or he needs to be removed. But I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if there's merit to this lawsuit, so I brought in Will Chamberlain, who is a lawyer. So today, let's take a look at the breaking news, talk with Will, and figure out is there actually merit to the suit, and will Jim Acosta actually get his press pass back? But before we get started, let me give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, Virtual Shield. Virtual Shield is a virtual private network service. What this does is it keeps your data safe while you browse the internet. It's a simple layer of security. And right now, if you go to hidewithtim.com, they have a Black Friday sale. You can get everything for 40% off. That's just $2.99 per month. Just click Get This Exclusive Deal, and you can get started with a free 30-day trial. I think it makes sense to have a simple layer of security while you're browsing the web, so for those that are interested, go to hidewithtim.com, and the link will be in the description below. From CNBC, CNN sues President Trump and White House for banning reporter Jim Acosta. In a statement, Sanders said the lawsuit was just more grandstanding from CNN, and vowed that the White House will vigorously defend itself. CNN alleges in its legal action, which has been filed in U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., that Acosta's First and Fifth Amendment rights were being violated with the ban. Acosta, who has frequently clashed with the Trump administration officials, had challenged the president about his characterization of a caravan of Central American migrants traveling to the U.S.-Mexico border. A female staffer then attempted to pull the microphone out from Acosta's hand, which he initially refused to surrender. "You're a rude, terrible person," Trump responded as Acosta continued to speak into a microphone being passed around to the gaggle of reporters present for the news conference in the White House. CNN is asking the court for a preliminary injunction that would reinstate Acosta's press credentials as soon as possible. While the suit is specific to CNN and Acosta, this could have happened to anyone, CNN said in a statement Tuesday morning. If left unchallenged, the actions of the White House would create a dangerous chilling effect for any journalist who covers our elected officials. But it isn't about this one event. Acosta has been called out numerous times. People have called for pulling his press pass months ago. So to understand whether or not this lawsuit has any merit, I brought in Will Chamberlain, who is a Trump supporter. He is a conservative, but he's also a lawyer, so he's going to shed some light on whether or not Jim Acosta could actually get his press credentials back.
I read the lawsuit. There is merit to it. There's a case from 1977 in the D.C. Circuit called Sherrill versus Knight, which is directly on point. A columnist for The Nation had their White House press pass revoked for quote-unquote security reasons that were very vague from the Secret Service. The district court held that the Secret Service needed to come up with specific and narrow standards for the revoking of press passes, because to do otherwise was a violation of the journalist's First Amendment rights. And the DC Circuit basically affirmed that, saying that unless there's a compelling reason that there is a First Amendment right for White House correspondents to have access to the press facilities. So there is some merit to this. That said, based on Jim Acosta's behavior, there actually is some compelling reason to exclude him from the White House briefing room, because he was physical with a aide to the president, with one of the White House interns. He can say in the complaint, they try to say that the video was doctored, that he was simply holding onto his microphone, but we've all seen the video, and it seems very clear that he physically tried to maintain control of the microphone by pushing on the arm of one of the White House aides. And so even if Mr. Acosta and CNN are able to win the argument that this was somewhat arbitrary, that there wasn't due process here, ultimately, I think that the White House will be able to show that they had a compelling reason to take away his press pass, because he was being physical with aides. Acosta has been what I would call a debater rather than a journalist for a while. Like, he's not going in there actually trying to ask questions and get answers so much as start an argument. But that said, that's First Amendment speech, and it's hard to say that that's sufficient reason in and of itself to remove him and deny him a White House press pass, given that there probably are legitimate First Amendment considerations at play. I think it's the rudeness and the lack of, and the physical disrespect for aides that strikes me as a reason. I mean, think about it from the White House and from even President Trump's perspective. Acosta was very, very rude and physical with one of his employees. I think part of showing respect for your own employees is having their back, and when your employee is both kind of handled and almost humiliated when they're essentially one of the reporters refuses to hand over a microphone and pushes them away, whether or not that's acceptable behavior and whether or not you stand by your employees. I think ultimately that's what this will come down to, and I think that's why at the end of the day, Acosta won't be getting his press pass back. I think they're going to lose the lawsuit eventually. I think what will end up happening, they have a good argument. Acosta has a good argument that there were some due process problems, in the sense that this DC Circuit case, Cheryl v. Knight, says that if you're going to take away somebody's press pass, you need to give them notice, an opportunity to be heard, and a written opinion, right, or a written decision. So you have to give them a chance to respond. I don't think that was done here. And if there is a due process right, then it's pretty clear that whatever Sarah Sanders did and whatever the Secret Service did, it wasn't enough. They never gave Acosta a chance to respond. They never gave them a written opinion, specifically laying out the reasons they were denying him the press pass. But that's just a procedural flaw, right? Like, so if a court says, well, you didn't do this right procedurally, what'll happen is it'll go back to the Secret Service. They'll suddenly say, we're revoking your press pass, Jim Acosta, for reasons 1, 2, and 3. You now have a chance to be heard. He can respond. And then they can give a final decision that says, we're still revoking your press pass, Jim Acosta, because you put your hands on that woman. Like, winning this procedural argument won't ultimately get his press pass back. He'll have to prove that it was unconstitutional, a violation of the First Amendment substantively, to take away the press pass. And I don't think he's going to be able to win that argument, because he ultimately was physical with a White House aide, which seems like a perfectly good reason to take away somebody's press pass.
So again, keeping in mind that Will is a conservative, I think he was pretty fair, and I trust his opinion on the matter. But I want to talk about all of the times Jim Acosta has been called out by mainstream media journalists, personalities, and even the left for grandstanding. Obviously, the right is critical of Jim Acosta. So we'll look at those stories, and then we'll move to when the left called him out. Newsweek reported June 12th, Trump's campaign manager wants CNN reporters' credentials revoked over questions during North Korea signing. And this was specific to when Trump and Kim Jong-un were signing documents. Jim Acosta yelled things. He was yelling questions. And I would argue that it may be inappropriate to yell while a signing is happening. It is still within his First Amendment rights. As a journalist, he's going to yell questions, whether they're inappropriate or not. This story from the Western Journal says, Hot Mike reveals Acosta outburst was intentional, malicious, and this is in response to what happened in North Korea. Naturally, The Blaze wrote about it, saying Jim Acosta is getting criticized for what he did at the Trump-Kim summit. But it's not just about outbursts, it's about other bad behavior. In October, The Hill reported CNN's Acosta sends private message to former Melania Trump aide, F you. This was in response to the aide saying Dear Diary to Jim Acosta. Now, Dear Diary is an insult that is insinuating Jim Acosta is making all of these stories about him and his personal experience instead of reporting. But obviously the right is going to call out Jim Acosta because he's challenging Donald Trump, right? But what about all the times the mainstream press has called out Jim Acosta? How about this story from the Washington Post? Grandstanding or truth teller? CNN's Acosta walks a fine line with Trump. They go on to say that Acosta's remarks aren't just blunt, they're unusual. Reporters are supposed to report, not opine. Yet Acosta's disdain has flowed openly, raising a question about how far a reporter, supposedly a neutral arbiter of facts, not a commenter on them, can and should go. How about when The Atlantic wrote, Jim Acosta's dangerous brand of performance journalism? Or over a year ago, when we saw this
virgin, let me go ahead and write you down on the board right here. Wow, can you guys show him some love? Can you guys show Steven some love on the board right here? Wow, Steven, you donated so much money. Oh my God, Steven, on my whiteboard.
You mentioned something interesting. Cypher is pursuing new research. He claims that what they're doing in Africa is the missing piece. A weapon to surpass Metal Gear.
Indeed. Good evening, chat. How are you feeling on this fine December evening? Not quite the end of the year yet, but I think we've still got a little bit of fun left in this one. Why bother putting down the reins right now? We've long since passed that point where you could have stopped, so why don't we just keep on going? I mean, I'm sure there's going to be something fun coming up over the next, what, 48 hours or something. I get a very distinct feeling that there will be. So, chat, how is everyone feeling over there? How is everyone? We've just it's a sweet cancer stream. Yes, it is. That is exactly what it is. Someone feels squidgy. I'm not entirely sure what you expect me to do about that. I can recommend a doctor to you. That's about it. Someone says there's still no chess Christmas. The chess pieces are not going to have Christmas, chat. You're just going to have to deal with it. They didn't deserve it. They didn't earn it. Right? Just deal with it. Deal with it. Someone else is drunk, and apparently we also have a naked person in chat. I mean, why not? There's someone else who feels like they should go to work. Well, you should, but that doesn't mean that you have to. See, these things are different. You have the agency, you have the free will to choose. Are you going to go to work, or are you going to stay here and watch the stream and hang out with the cancerous chat? And as someone else in chat has pointed out, why not both? Why not go to work and still be here to indulge in the cancerous event chat? Someone is asking me, will I be attending Kilroy? I don't think anyone's going to be attending Kilroy at the moment. That absolute shit show of a scam is just hemorrhaging people left, right, and center. And for good reason, I would say. So I don't think anyone's going to be there. It's going to be like 3 people and a ball pit It's basically DashCon 2.0 at this point, and I'm fucking loving it. I'm just sitting back and laughing my face off it. So many failures over the past, like, 3 weeks. And just thinking to myself, you know what? I told you so. And that's it. I don't have to say anything more, and I'm not going to, because, you know what? I ain't getting involved in none of that shit. Because I don't care, and it doesn't affect me, and I want to keep it that way. So, chat. Story the first that we're going to be going into. We've gotta check out some of that good old-fashioned cants. And I do think that this story is, well, slightly cancerous. So let's see what went on when a liberal Democrat politician said that schools should be able to suggest prostitution as a career to pupils. I'm sure that went down really, really well, and I'm sure some of those pupils may very well have also been told about doing that same thing. I was trying to think of a much funnier and wittier joke about things going down and going down well, but I couldn't come up with one. So I'm sorry, chat, I failed you. But you know what, now we get to have that little awkward moment, and those are sometimes funny as well, so it's all good. Let's see what actually went on with the story as a whole, though. Yes, that... I don't know why, something about that guy's face just... Yeah. It doesn't surprise me that he wants to tell little kiddies to become prostitutes. Just something about his face and the way he's grinning there, it's just... That's life, I suppose. A Liberal Democrat councillor has told a party conference that schools should suggest prostitution as a career to pupils. Dennis Parsons, who's a chairman of the Cheltenham Liberal Democrats, made the comment during a special session on sex work. Because of course he did. The retired civil servant said school career officers are currently not allowed to mention prostitution as a potential line of work, but added, why shouldn't they? Well, the fact that there's a whole load of questions about the legality of prostitution in the UK would be one thing. It's kind of a weird scenario that we've got here. Prostitution technically isn't illegal, but paying for sex is. It's really weird like that in this country. It's like, okay, you can be a prostitute and that's totally fine, but no one can actually use your services because then that would be illegal. As far as I'm aware, that's still how the law works around it. It may have changed since the last time I looked at it, but if it hasn't, then, well, you can tell how messed up that situation is. So the quickest solution, I think, to that is simply bring a camcorder in with you. Because it's not prostitution if you're paying them as an actress to make a pornography film. It's just a great way of getting around it. Mr. Parsons also compared prostitution with accountancy when discussing how to combat the stigma attached to sex work. Yes, I can see all of the parallels between those two careers. In fact, I can see so many parallels between those two careers that I don't actually even need to list them off because they are just that numerous. Lib Dem leader Tim Farron distanced himself from the remarks, unsurprisingly, but revealed he will not slap down Mr. Parsons for making the statement that people should be allowed to say shocking things. I actually agree. Yes, people should be allowed to say shocking things. People should also be allowed to say stupid things. And then other people should be allowed to come along and mock those people for saying stupid things. Mr. Parsons in Number 5 said the fact that we're asking should we seek to prevent people entering sex work is part of the problem. You wouldn't ask the question, should we prevent people becoming accountants? You'd just take it for granted. Yes, but in a country where prostitution is in this really weird and stupid grey zone about legality, you might want to sort that bit out before saying to kids, hey, have you ever considered getting fucked for a living? Well, given the economy that most of those kids are going to grow up into, most of them are going to be fucked for a living anyway. Just not in the literal sense. So, yeah, maybe sort that out. If you want kids to be able to consider prostitution, then you should probably be working towards legalizing prostitution, legalizing the purchase of sex, legalizing sex as a trade commodity, getting all the legislation passed, getting people registered, taxed, all of that good stuff, and then you can maybe consider starting to suggest it as a career path. Because until you've done all of that, it's not really a career. As someone in chat is pointing out, have we considered growing and selling drugs for a living? Well, absolutely. I mean, hey, everything's on the table now, apparently, so let's just go with it, shall we? There is a stronger case, probably, for that than there is for preventing sex work. We have had a chap suggest that one of the areas we need to be concerned about was families coercing people to go into the sex trade. Well, again, you wouldn't protest a family urging and coercing people into becoming accountants. Look, dude. You need to sort out prostitution as an enterprise first before telling people to go into it. Okay, because crimes of legality or lack of legality surrounding it in the UK, that must be exposed. I really have nothing else to add. That's kind of the entire point. And even in this room full of liberals, we've got a huge cultural problem that we do see sex work as different. Well, it is. It just is. Let's take your accountancy example again. It's legal for me to be an accountant, but it's illegal for you to use my accounting firm. Yeah. Do you see how that's not accounting? So obviously that is how prostitution works. You see them differently because they are different things. Please, sir, reconsider this, because you seem to be making some false equivalencies here, and I really would rather that you didn't, because that makes the discourse on the subject very difficult. We see it as something a little bit tacky, and not quite nice, and not the sort of thing that we would want our sons and daughters to get involved in. Yeah, I mean, I think even if you legalized it and made it all above board, that would still be the attitude of parents out there. Oh sure, they might say that accepted, like, deep down inside they really head. It's their eyes, you will see it. Their hope and optimism for the future of their lives are gone. They will just be afraid. We talk about schools. How many schools are going to have careers officers? Say to people, have you thought about prostitution? It's not going to happen, and that's a culture. Why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they? Chat, why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they? It should be legal, but heavily frowned upon, someone suggests here. Someone saying, Xildia, but can you be an accountant for a prostitute? Actually, I remembered reading something actually about accessories to prostitution, yeah, people who go around basically as the sort of protection and things like that. And I believe that legally, yes, you can, because prostitution isn't illegal. I think that's what the takeaway of that was. It was literally just buying the sex worker, but being the sex worker and therefore having object tangible money is, I believe that's how that ended. I'm not go check that out in your own time, because I actually don't know. I think not sure. This person claims to be an old-fashioned liberal and spent most of his career in London, while also working as first secretary in the British Embassy in Tokyo. Yes, I wonder where he got his taste for prostitution then, because, well, we all know Tokyo, well, just East Asia and East Asia in general, because, oh, you so big white man. Yes, those people do exist out there, because, oh, you big white man, so on and so forth. He also says that he enjoys campaigning and is a supporter of Chelsea FC, while also having a season ticket at his local club, Cheltenham Town FC. Oh well, that's just totally humanised, doesn't it? I can totally understand where you're coming from on this subject now that we've put some humanising details on that article. I identify with you now. I actually care about you as a... Oh no, wait, I don't. I still think you're a moron who's confronting this issue completely arse backwards. Which is also what we're encouraging these kids to do. They shouldn't. And after his remarks on Converse and pragmatism, it's a wonderful thing that we are in a party where those sorts of views can be expressed and you can have that sort of exchange. Someone had gotten very triggered in chat and just shouted, "There is no constitution in Tokyo." You are uninformed. Really, there is no constitution in Tokyo. None whatsoever. Okay, if you say so, but just for the record, I don't fucking believe you at all. Like, this is the place where you can go and buy clothes. I frankly find it impossible to believe that in a very large city there isn't someone giving little handies, giving a little sucky for Dora in some little motel somewhere or something. You know, oh, here we go. It's illegal. It's illegal. Look, it doesn't matter if stuff is illegal. People still do it. So, yes. They're certainly not my views. Generally, the equivalence between sexual and pregnancy is not one that I share. Okay, so my question to you then is, why did you say it? Like, why would you then say, why would you compare these things and then say, but I don't actually think so you acknowledge that they're different. Okay, well that's good. Then you should be able to understand why the comparison that you made earlier is ridiculous. Here we go, got someone in chat, they fucked a hooker in Tokyo. That came with a donation of £2. Was that like a reference to how much you paid for the hooker in Tokyo? Because if that's the case, dude, pour some Listerine on your junk and go and see a doctor in the morning, because it's, yeah. Because you might have a problem there. I think we are in a position where we are a liberal party, and it's not for me to go telling anyone that they can't have views and share them. I actually agree with that sentiment. Very good. We have reached an accord on that particular topic. So that's a nice thing. That's how you get to the bottom of these things. Phrasing around that. Actually, if you believe that we're talking about careers, then what you really want is for people to be able to explore ideas, and that means sometimes saying things that are quite shocking. Well, yeah, by all means, suggest people really stupid ideas which are really damaging to them, not only from a health perspective, but also a mental perspective, because brain can't really be separated from sex, and having many sexual partners actually has been demonstrated across numerous psychological studies to actually then damage your ability to trust people and to maintain basic relationships with your partners. Also, I think it also did some problem with intimacy with people. Like, it resulted in less satisfaction with a partner that you wanted to stay with, so you basically end up self-sabotaging yourself. So, just a thing to consider. So no, I'm not going to go slapping people down. The whole point of having a debate is that you test different opinions and you come out with on the basis of evidence. Delegates heard that decriminalising prostitution would raise $1 billion a year for the Treasury in taxes. And yeah, that's a pretty good one. That is a pretty good point right there. If you are looking to make some extra money for the state, legalising and regulation and taxing the industry would be a way of doing that. That's a whole other kettle of fish over there. The problems that I think prostitution causes socially are really not what it's actually worth it. Very damaged people damage a lot of people are walking around at the moment, it might actually be an improvement, because at least then they'd be damaged people with a smile on their faces. So I guess that could maybe actually be a good thing. We could certainly give it some consideration. So chat, how's everyone feeling? Someone's just simply suggesting get a sex doll and her feelings out of it. I approve of this joke. Maybe we need to tax prostitutes. They already got fucked rats. Zing! Well done. Well done, sir. Young girls should really consider the whining about liberals on YouTube and 15-year-old boys career option. Yeah, well, that's a thing. It's why don't at these career days, well, I don't actually know if they do this or not, why don't they actually say, like, hey, let's go with the whole YouTube thing. Why don't you become an online entertainer? Why don't you become a cam girl? Let's put that on the table, shall we? Let's put the cam girl thing on the table. Let's start saying to, 50-year-old girls, hey, in 1 year, you're going to be totally legal. So they're going to be saying, hey, you're 16 years old, get yourself, invest in a nice high-quality webcam, maybe ask for one for Christmas or something, and get shaking that ass on the interwebs, and old guys will throw their credit cards at you, and it'll be great. You can make hundreds and hundreds of pounds every single day for doing basically nothing. Or alternatively, as chat is pointing out, Twitch streamer. You could just be a Twitch streamer, do the same thing, but without having to get naked or actually do sexual things. Just sit there, play League of Legends really badly or something while wearing a low-cut top, and go ahead, write some names on a whiteboard while showing off your arse in a set of really tight yoga pants. The ones so tight you can actually see, or just straight tights. Just go. Just say like, hey, that's a career choice. Oh, that's an interesting question here. If he's advocating for prostitution as a career choice and most prostitutes are women, does this mean he feels women don't belong in STEM? Ooh, now that's an interesting question. I'd be intrigued to see his answer for that one. But also we'd have to have a discussion about the wage gap in prostitution as well, because as we all know, well, when it comes to pornography, women, women earn, I think, 10 times? Was it 10 times more than men? Or was it bigger than that? Not entirely sure. So we'd have to have that discussion as well, and the overrepresentation of women. Oh no, that conversation wouldn't happen because of feminism. See, chat is also pointing out lots of constructive advice tonight. Yes, chat, you're being constructive tonight. You are on the ball. That's great. So good for you, chat. You're like 90% cancer at the moment. That's the best that you've ever been. I wonder if we can continue going along that way. So, someone actually also asked me, are there going to be more Guppy videos? Would you be upset if the answer was yes? Because I'm tempted. I'm tempted to talk more about Guppies. Anyway, second story. Let's actually get on track and do the thing that we're here to do. Because speaking of the women in STEM as a topic, well, we've got to consider that in all the ways that they're disadvantaged. Because apparently we have this, taking the P out of physics, how boys are getting a leg up. Oh, I'm sure you know where this is gonna go, just from the title alone. Physics is heavily skewed towards boys because they have a unique advantage when it comes to understanding projectile motion and, argues Anna Wilson, Kate Wilson and David Lowe, it's an area too heavily relied on in many curricula. Projectile motion. Taking the P, projectile motion. You know where this is going, chap. You know where this is going, and it's cancerous, but we have to go because you send me things like this, so I don't really have that much of a choice. Let's do it. Some of you will think we're daft. Yes, those would be the sensible people. Some will wonder what kind of jobs we have if we have enough time on our hands to dream up this kind of thing. No, I know what kind of jobs you have. I'm gonna guess you're probably social scientists, and you probably spend a lot of your time sitting around, well, thinking of stupid shit like this, trying to base the entire world on everything being socially constructed and literally any way to turn women into the victims of anything. Some of you may even think we're having you on. Yes, I do. Our intentions, however, are honourable. Playful urination practices proceed to games such as P-ball, where men compete using their urine to destroy a ball placed in the urine. That would be a urinal paint. Just so you know. May give boys an advantage over girls when it comes to physics. We believe there's something we can do about it. I love the logic is literally you can pee standing up, therefore you're a physics genius. But actually, chat has had very similar sentiment. I piss standing up, therefore I am a genius physicist. Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Okay. Do you know how you can get girls to have this same unfair advantage that boys have? Just buy them a water pistol. You can actually buy water pistols, which are, well, not even water pistols. There's things which are basically just like a squidgy ball with like a spout and a hole, and you just put it in the water, squidge the air out of it, pull it so it vacuums into it, spray it like that. You can get ones like that to remove like phlegm and mucus from babies' noses, but there's also versions of that which are just toilet. Buy your girls that if you're really concerned about this massive unfair advantage of boys being able to play with projectile liquids here. No doubt you have some questions. Oh, you don't even understand. The first, which is probably what could possibly lead us to believe this. Well, I know what's led you to believe this. You're a bunch of idiots. You're a bunch of very smart idiots. You're the kind of smart idiot. You're clearly smart enough to think your way through all of these ridiculous mental gymnastics, but that's the part that then reveals the stupidity of your intelligence. Jeez. Rather than amusing. So, well, for starters, our recent analysis of the kinds of physics questions females generally do worse at than males. Add to that strong evidence for the widespread nature of certain kinds of key-based game playing among young and not so young boys. Finally, throw in our observations of curriculum sequencing and the ways in which formal mathematically codified physics is often introduced to children and young people. This is the hard physics argument again. I've seen that argument before. That's the men have a better understanding of physics because rigid physics advantages their bodies because penis, and fluid physics is something that women are better at, and as a result you have to do fluid stuff first as opposed to rigid construct stuff first. Yes, they actually seriously believe this, but apparently now boys are just better at fluid physics equations as well because you're just... My god. As someone's pointing in chat, guys can't compete with women's in the ping pong ball, for instance. Yeah, there you go. Buy your daughter a ping pong ball. Give her a tie lesson. She'll be completely fine. Yeah, chat I think has the right of it here. Women are inferior because... Yes, that is what people like this basically base their entire ideas on. It's turning women into the victim of everything. It might as well actually just be women are inferior because... And then they just shit out whatever complete nonsense comes to their mind there. Then the rest of us can just go along, not having to listen to their crap. Let us explain in more detail. I really would rather that you didn't, but okay. The gender gap in physics and other related subjects, including engineering, has long been a cause for concern, even though women have a hiring advantage in their favour when it comes to STEM. Women simply do not want to do these jobs. When you give them the choice, they tend to choose different things. If you haven't learned that by how incredibly free so many Western countries, like, why is it that places like Iran have more women in STEM fields than places like the UK? It's because they don't really have as much of a choice. It's the same thing in India. Because they don't have any choice. They need to take any job in order to survive. When you give people choices, what a surprise that different inclinations have different patterns. It's amazing. And this has led to both educational innovations as well as policy interventions such as chicken for the equation, sage and wise, or is that supposed to be soggy? Just soggy the whole thing, just obliterate it, that's what we need to do for this article. However, there is little evidence that such campaigns have much effect. I wonder why. For example, WISE was set up in the UK in 1984. In that time, the fraction of female students studying science and technology has hovered around the 20%. Therefore, we have to ask, why don't young women perform as well in physics? Okay, here's another thing I want us to consider. If you do the whole affirmative action thing, which I would wager quite a large number of these places do, what you're then doing is you're taking in people who have lower academic ability into these fields. If they happen to be women, because you really want the women in there, then those women are simply not as smart as the men on the course because they had lower entry requirements, which is why so many of them will struggle. This is the fact of affirmative action being damaging for the people that it is supposed to help. Just all of the things to think. But apparently this is all down to dicks and pee. I'm starting to think Sigmund Freud was actually not such a massive factor. Role models and external pressure. Of course, there are likely to be a number of complex interacting reasons, some of which can be changed more easily than others. The majority of physicists are male, and this reinforces a masculine culture. Here we go, because culture is everything, am I right, guys? Humans are total blank slates. Historically, logical and mathematical ways of thinking have long been associated with masculinity, although all three of us would argue that such models of thinking are not particularly masculine or feminine. Most physics teachers are male, and so there aren't many female role models for physics students. I'm getting sick of this "you need to have role models of your own gender" nonsense. You can be inspired by anyone, be they male or female. That's all you really need them to do, is be an inspirational character. But also, the other thing to consider is, when we do really basic tests on males and females, and we can do these on species which are not human but are quite closely related to primates and certain monkeys, and we get similar patterns. The males gravitate more towards technical things with moving components and whatnot, and females tend to gravitate towards more social toys, things like dolls and model people. So it seems like, first of all, there's a natural inclination in that way anyway. And second of all, when you start doing tests around other things, such as 3D rotation tests, sort of mentally working out 3D rotation, even things like parking cars, men tend to outperform women in those things. Now, obviously, those tests are done on people who are older, so there is potentially a degree of socialization there. But when you're starting from a base point before the socialization stage, where you see different patterns in behavior from males to females, it's kind of like, well, the social stuff is clearly then being built atop something else that's already there. Moving ever so swiftly onwards. There may also be cultural effects outside the discipline. Parents may offer boys more encouragement to study physics as it leads to later study of, for example, engineering, another field that struggles to recruit and retain women. 2-to-1 hiring bias. To some extent, we may be trapped in something of a vicious circle. The apparent male domination and masculinity of physics may repel females who might otherwise be interested in the conceptual structure of scientific approach. After all, women are put off by the science-ness of biology or increasingly chemistry. Well, no, they're not. Well, what should this tell you? Does this tell you that women are being put off by the existence of men in the fields? No, it doesn't. They go into the fields that interest them. Could it simply be that fewer women are interested in physics and engineering as opposed to biology? Because certain fields of biology are massively dominated by women compared to men. Does that... But the thing is, does that stop men from going into those fields? Well, the answer is no. There are still men even in those fields. So it seems almost to me, you know, to my clearly untrained eye, having totally not looked at all of the psychological studies around this, at having never looked at biology studies of brains, anything like that. You know, I've totally not spent years of my life at this point reading all of that literature. But I just want to say, it seems to me like maybe the genders of the people involved don't matter. Just a thing to consider there. Someone in chat has pointed out, and it's quite correct, biology is easier to learn and the concepts are more relatable to a graspable reality. Yes, it's true. Biology is just easier than chemistry. Chemistry is easier than physics. Physics is easier than mathematics. You know, mathematics, just being good at maths will help you. So that's just a thing, and that's why maths is universally useful. You should always attempt to do well. Always be good at maths. It will help you. The finger of blame has also been pointed at poor, there we go, or at least gender-based pedagogy with curricula and textbooks filled with images of male scientists and male-orientated examples and contexts, such as footballs, rockets, and cannons. Do you know what physics is used in quite a lot? Yeah, rockets, NASA, things like that. Physics is really, really useful there. That's not a gendered example. That's a really practical example of shit that you'd be doing in the field. But there may be another reason too. Here we go. Let's see what the other reason is here. We've been examining gender differences in achievement on both standard diagnostic and competitive physics tasks. We found that not only do girls underperform on these tests, but that the difference in performance arises primarily from specific question types. In particular, the largest gap in performance between the girls and boys arise in questions that involve projectile motion. Things that have been thrown, kicked, fired, etc. In some projectile questions, we've seen around 1/3 of girls answer correctly compared to 2/3 of boys. This is a trivial gap in performance, particularly when a diagnostic test may contain several questions on projectiles. Okay, right. Let me just put a little thing in. In fact, they go on here, even in this paragraph, they mention, you know, ball sports and throwing and catching and things like that. Okay. Here we go, yes. This theory implicitly acknowledges the privacy of utopian mechanics. So basically, playing ball games, throwing and kicking things, etc., apparently gives you an intuitive understanding of Newtonian mechanics, except that it doesn't. Because the physics formula that we're going to be using are just that, they are formula. Okay? You don't throw a ball and suddenly your brain explodes into a matrix green text scrawling screensaver sort of thing where you're like, oh, I understand the formula and how it works and it's all in my mind. It doesn't work like that. You have to actually sit and learn the numbers and what they do. You don't have to throw a ball to understand the physics of throwing a ball. It's just stupid. It hurts my brain. So here we go. Interesting point from the chat again. Chat being surprisingly interesting today. So even monkeys fall in the pool are better at physics than women. Well, I can only assume that they must be because they throw their feces at things, like potentially on a daily or weekly basis. So I'm guessing they must be really good at physics. I'm guessing that the chimpanzee's grasp of Newtonian mechanics must be absolutely stellar when compared to the human female who has never flung her own feces or pissed standing up against a wall or something like that. Just clearly what this means is that we need to have more chimpanzees in physics. More chimps in STEM. That's what we need to be doing, chat. Hashtag more chimps in STEM. Because they will obviously have some implicit knowledge on this subject. In addition, we might expect the achievement to already bless girls and women who embrace a wish to challenge the conventional skills in this discipline. However, we don't see reduced young students enrolled at the Australian Defence Force Academy. The young women of the age of 11 have already chosen to pursue life in what might be seen as a hostile environment, and by virtue of the UFA's physical strength and fitness entry requirements, together with the Academy's compulsory sport program, are likely to have a lot of experience in all sports. Are they really good at physics? Just inherently? No, they're not. Challenging to gender gap, to patriarchy, and stuff. This suggests there's another reason for girls' relative underperformance, and it must be one that specifically results in facility and the same sensitivity to environmental, socio-cultural factors, and embodied learning, illustrates aspects of common lived experiences. Here we go. Well, lived experience that might lead male students to understand like many parents of small and not so small boys, two of us, AW and DL, have observed the predictable take in urination, a process by which they produce an direct, visible projectile arc. Like, was I weird as a child that I didn't feel the need to like try and piss up as long as high as I could or anything like that? Like, it was just something that never appealed to me in my parents. Is this actually more common than these authors are making out this? I'm getting from the impression that it's that most people are supposed to like play urine or something. Really? And here we go with the visible projectile arc. Are you sure that it's the projectile arc that they're playing with, and not just squeezing as hard as you can so that you can try and erode the urinal cake in one go because you're a massive dick like that and you just want to destroy it? See, apparently there's a lot of people in chat just saying, no, I'm not unusual because why the hell would you do that? It's like, no, you're still weird, Dilly, but you're not weird in that regard. Okay, that's great. That's good to know. So saying Sir Isaac Newton has the world record for the world's furthest stream of piss. Does he also hold the world records for the world's strongest blast piece? Because I think that might have been the aim of what more of these boys perhaps do. Urinal cake eroding! Gone! The fact that boys and men hold their ability to projectile is hardly contentious. I disagree. I think that it is contentious. I think you're just asserting that more people do this than actually do. Boys are trained to make in toilet bowls with 14 targets, a huge variety of which can be bought on Amazon. No, again, not a thing that I did. Was this a thing that chat did? Did chat have little plastic ducks or something for you to knock over when you were learning to do this? as chat's pointing out here, we just need to understand how mathematical functions work. Yeah, learn that. Don't. If you're trying to learn physics by urinating, you're doing it wrong. Meanwhile, YouTube videos explain how to write your name in the snow with your pen, and the post-match celebration and the tactics of sportsmen are widely reported in the media. Maybe I don't read the correct kind of media to be seeing those stories, but I have never seen this. Also, I've never seen a video on YouTube of like a tutorial of how to write your name in the snow with urine. Do you know why? It's because I've never fucking looked it up. Are you seriously telling me that you think the majority of men go on YouTube and look at that? Like, really, is that a majority of men who do this? Because I really don't think that it is. Indeed, the very notion of a pissing contest, furthest, highest, most precisely aimed, is a deeply embedded part of some cultures. Okay, citations needed. Citation needed everywhere throughout this article. Alexander Pope includes a pissing contest in his narrative poem, The Dunciad, or Dunciad, I don't know how you're supposed to say that. Our own children describe a stepped wall behind their primary school that's used by male students for competitive target practice. Oh, okay, sure. Are your children also really woke 8-year-olds? This seems like a spin-off of the woke 8-year-old meme. Yeah, my children just happen to do the thing that really proves my point for me. Yeah, sure they do, of course. And the colleague who grew up in the Canada Arctic describes boys competing to see who could perfect the trajectory so that what ascended as liquid fell as ice crystals. Oh, okay, was he the exception here? Was this what most of them did? I require some evidence for these claims of yours, because frankly I think they're ridiculous. And chat seems to just be thinking, what the fuck are you even talking about as well? And just so you know, there's like 1,200 people watching this right now, my dear authors. So perhaps these people aren't as common as you are asserting. This self-directed, hands-on, intrinsically and sometimes extrinsically and socially rewarded activity must have a huge potential contribution to it. Must it? Must this play a huge part in their learning ability? Or is it just something that some people do because they're gross and they don't actually really learn anything from it because their urine stream is not a thin projectile of matrix code that allows you to just learn everything to do with physics? And this results in a deep, embodied material knowledge of projectile motion that's simply not accessible to girls. Women, girls, they can urinate standing up. You just have to kind of thrust your hips forward. You can get a projectile going forward there, or you can squat, really try and get your butt on your heels, and you can get a little arc going that way. Maybe girls should be doing that then, if you really think this is such a massive advantage to them. Get those female urinals that have the really long trough that goes in between their legs, or those troughs in the floor, which are basically just a gutter with 2 foot pads on either side. Maybe you should do that. If this is such a fucking amazing learning tool. Like, why is this not done in physics classes if it's just so goddamn amazing? Got a good point here in chat. I think they are endorsing the adage, when you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bullshit. Yeah, that's the feeling I'm getting from this. To transfer this to an understanding to typical contextualized questions in mechanics curricula is not likely to be difficult either, as mentioned above. Excuse me. The favourite scenarios of projectile motion exercises are often aiming a ball or a cannon and involve drawing a trajectory line that must recall those sparkling arcs of urine. No. If you just draw an arc, it's going to be wrong. You have to take into account the numbers of the equation in order to draw the correct arc. Just looking at arcs doesn't do it. Okay, look, let's have a load of water fountains. Now, let's do that. Let's find some arc water fountains. You know, those projectile ones that shoot things like this. Here we go. Look, let's have some of these. Let's have some of these. Let's put these outside of all of the schools. You know, maybe those big water cannons that you find at water parks so you can shoot people with streams of water. Maybe we should just put them outside of every single school so that everyone can play with them and all become physics geniuses. It's just... this is nonsense. It's complete and utter nonsense. I hate my life and I hate this article. Just, changing the flow. Here we go. I'm gonna skip bits of this because I want this to end. I want this to be over. However, we can make a change. It's not necessary for physics curricula to begin with projectile motion. Other topics such as energy conservation, which is more central to physics, could be taught first instead. This all comes from the flawed assumption that because boys have dicks, they understand physics better. I mean, what is it? When you eliminate men pissing standing up, let's say it becomes illegal and you manage to sissify men to the point where they all piss standing down. What's going to be next? Is the good old meat windmill, is that going to be something that is then an advantage to, you know, spinning their dicks around like that? Is that going to be the good old meat spin? Is that going to be an unfair advantage in physics once you've eliminated that one? Is that something? Is that something else? Oh, God damn it. Just, I hate my life. Why do you send me this stuff, chat? Or do you not send it to me? Is it just people who never watch the streams? They just want to know that they have succeeded in making me rage quit the internet. Did I say get them to piss standing down? Wow, that was a mistake, wasn't it? Yes, pissing when standing down, it's a military technique for de-escalating a situation. What you do is you go into the hostage situation and you piss standing down. That's where you play urine games with the people holding the hostages. You get that bromance going over playing the urine games, and then everyone's lives are saved. That's what it means to piss standing down. I've totally not just made that up. It's actually, obviously, it's a thing. Clearly it's... Oh dear. No, just fuck this article. It's done. I hate my life and everything about it. It's just awful. But on the subject of liquids, we're going to be talking a little bit more about that later. So chat, how do you feel? Some people are saying clipped. Are you going to quote mine that entire segment? I bet you are. Because chat. We should have Antifa employ this tactic. We'll go and urinate in front of people, and we can bond over some urine. That would be, I thought it was pee on the hostage to claim your property. Someone else is waiting for the mathematical curve of ejaculation and its effect on the gender gap. You see, it's going to be that. It's going to be that. Anything about men doing man things is just going to be something that these people try to use as some sort of proof that women suck at something for a reason. It's like, my God, how lower opinion do these people have of women that they have to scrape this barrel so fucking hard to find anything to try to explain why women don't do as well as men in a certain field. But even then, that's retarded, because there's going to be females working in physics who perform just as well as the men, which is why they work in physics. So, busted. Myth busted. You're done. It doesn't work. I hate my life. I'm going to drink this water, and then we're going to talk about the next story. The two things are related. That is a delicious beverage right there. So, apparently, what I have just done there is newsworthy, according to ABC, who have pointed out that a thirsty Trump interrupts speech for sips of Fiji water. Yes, this is news. This is the relentless onslaught from the mainstream media trying to do literally anything to shit-talk Trump. What was it? First of all, it was Trump eats McDonald's. Then it was Trump has some ice cream with a cake or something like that. And now Donald Trump drinks water. Oh my god. What a fucking amazing news story this is. The president sometimes eats and drinks things. Wow. This is absolute front page news that everyone needs to hear. This is the most important thing in the world. Just okay. Let's see just what did they have to say about this. So, President Donald Trump took a swig of Marco Rubio's Playbook Wednesday. Teal dear, I'd like to take a moment, if I may, to introduce you to one of feminism's many rabbit holes. This one in particular comes from a live stream I did on Honey Badger Radio not all that long ago. Specifically on the Bunny and Doe Show episode 4, Sexist Men Be Crazy. And on that stream, we looked at an article from the Washington Post entitled Sexist Men Have Psychological Problems. And that article was reporting on a particular meta-analysis, which was looking at asserted masculine norms and how some of them can be damaging. Long story short, the article was a very poor misrepresentation of what the study was actually saying. What was quite interesting about this particular study was how it came to our attention. And I'll give you the first couple of minutes of that live stream so that it can be explained to you. Because I just showed up to look at the paper. I had nothing to do with actually finding it. And this way the words come from the person who actually found it, so I'm not going to be making any mistakes in telling you what happened. So yay, it's time for an origin story movie.
Okay, so the way I came across this was I was invited to a Facebook group called Against the Odds, YouTubers Working Together for Men. The group was put together by Chrissy-ocity. Chrissy-ocity is a YouTuber that appeared on the, you might remember her from the Questions for Anti-SJWs. Her profile picture is a Liechtenstein painting, and Christy Winters was also in that video. Christy Winters is part of this group, and she posted because she is doing research for some video dealing with men's issues. But Christy often comes at this topic from a, feminist version of men's issues perspective, which involves, toxic masculinity, it's men's fault, and so on. So this is what she wrote when she posted it. Posting because this article deals with men's mental health, an issue this group is committed to working on, right? please don't shoot the messenger, me, because of the meta-analysis results of the study's finding. So when I saw it, I thought, well, let me take a look at this article because it was entitled Sexist Men Have Psychological Problems. And I thought, well, since Christy Winters is always asking us to do more robust analyses of feminist work, why don't we do something that she claims is, good enough or robust enough to use? So that's how we came across this.
Okay, so that's the important backstory out of the way. This study is being pointed to by the various feminists on the interwebs as being a particularly robust piece, presenting very good data in a particularly reliable fashion. Unsurprisingly, in that live stream, Brian, Bunny, and myself disagreed. And one part of our disagreement came from the inventory that the researchers were using to code masculinity. They were using a scale which they call the Conformity to Masculine Norms Inventory, which is an inventory of 11 distinct factors, which are winning, emotional control, risk-taking, violence, dominance, playboy, self-reliance, primacy of work, power over women, disdain for homosexuals, and pursuit of status. Now, at the time in that live stream, we did note that some of those traits seemed a little bit odd, to say the least. And there were a lot of questions raised about how exactly some of these terms have been developed and defined. For instance, risk-taking behavior as being something masculine. Now, it was posited in the live stream that drinking to excess is a risk-taking behavior, and that is a behavior that we see women engaging in as well as men. The disdain for homosexuality was also something that was questioned. There have been societies where pedestry has been normalized, and there are some practices which exist even to this day which can definitely be considered a pretty damn gay, which are actually rites of passage into manhood. One example that immediately springs to mind was an example that I found while researching the video Oxford Doesn't Understand Genital Mutilation, a video in which I looked at various genital cutting rituals from all around the world. And one of the examples in that video comes from Australia and its Aboriginal culture, wherein the men would bifurcate their genitals. That is, the length of their penis will basically be split in two. And there is a ritual in some of those cultures, which while reading about it seems to continue to this day, wherein a young boy is made to place his erect penis in between the bifurcation of an older man's genitals and rub back and forth, that is, basically have penile sex with each other until they ejaculate, and that this is considered a rite of passage. Now that practice is very homosexual. It's two guys using their genitals to stimulate each other until they ejaculate, and yet that's considered fairly normal and masculine to do. So with things like this being known, the CMNI being used in this research seems to have been developed from a very Eurocentric point of view. Now that doesn't make it inherently wrong, but it does very distinctly bias the results when you're attempting to claim that these are masculine traits, as in something that universally men display. And these are just a few points which came up during the stream, and that I've had a bit of time to dwell upon afterwards. But going forward, I was quite interested in where this conformity to masculine norms inventory came from, and how it was actually developed, because it seems to be nothing more than the author's assertion of what they consider masculine behavior to be. So I went digging through the citations of the paper, and I found what I believe to be the origin of the Conformity to Masculine Norms Inventory. And it appears to be a paper titled The Development of the Conformity to Masculine Norms Inventory. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is where it came from. And I read through this paper, and I have found what I consider to be several issues with this particular inventory. And frankly, I would consider some of these problems to be so long that they invalidate this as a legitimate model to use in any sort of analysis. So I'd like to go through this and share some of those with you. So the paper does have an introduction where it just talks about the idea of social norms and rules, and how there are basically socially agreed upon ideas and concepts about how people should behave. Because yes, there are standards that people have, and there are generally accepted ones and generally frowned upon ones. And that's completely reasonable. Obviously, the introduction does go on to talk about why they want to develop a scale, and it mentions some of the other studies that they read before getting to this point. It's a fairly standard introduction. It just outlines the thought process in getting up to the point where the author then says, I propose constructing the CMI to explain these patterns of behavior, and to further expand on the research of others, and yada yada yada. Again, it's pretty standard stuff. The point which I'm most interested in is then the section which is actually talking about the construction of the CMNI. So we're going to read through that, and then I'm going to point out what I consider to be the pretty major flaws in this. Construction of the CMNI. The inventory was constructed to assess the extent that an individual male conforms or does not conform to the actions, thoughts, and feelings that reflect masculine norms in the dominant culture in the US society. So I'm glad that in this paper they are specifically stating that this is to do with the US. So it's only trying to assess one specific cultural profile of masculinity, not just all men's behavior in general. So that's nice that they've cleared that up. This construct was chosen because Mahalik 2000 posited that gender role norms from the most dominant or powerful group in society affect the experiences of persons in that group, as well as persons in all other groups. Thus, the expectations of masculinity as constructed by Caucasian middle and upper class heterosexuals should affect members of that group and every other male in the US society who is held to those standards and experiences accepted from the majority, in part based on the powerful group's masculinity norms. So this is where my first objection to this begins. The assumption, and that's all it is, because as this paper says, it is positive this it hasn't been demonstrated, it's merely asserted, that masculinity is being defined by a small group of middle and upper class heterosexual white males. Sounds a little bit like the feminist patriarchy assertion, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt here. Now, this assertion that this author makes here, I think misses out a very fundamental piece of the puzzle, and that is the influence that women have on the behavior of men. Anyone who has studied biology or animal behavior to pretty much any level should be aware of the basic process of survival of the fittest. The idea that whatever animal is suited best to its particular environment is more likely to pass on its genes than those which are less well suited, and that this is a constant competition within a species for that individual to basically mate and pass on their genes. Now, survival of the fittest is only a part of the equation that is reproduction. Another part, which this author seems to have neglected, is the concept of sexual selection, sometimes referred to as the Fisherian runway or runway selection. And this is another factor in reproduction and animal behavior which seems to be somewhat at odds with survival of the fittest, but is actually just another part of the equation. A perfect example of this, and probably the most used because it's really obvious, is the peacock. The peacock's tail is in no way survival of the fittest. This massive display tail actually prevents males from reaching peak optimum fitness. It is a massive calorie investment, and the result of owning such a massive ornate behind is that the males then have a reduced ability to fly and maneuver in the air. It makes running more awkward for them. It makes hiding from predators more awkward, not only because they are garishly coloured and stand out like a sore thumb in pretty much any environment, but they're also incapable of hiding in small places. This tail should be evolutionary suicide, and yet it isn't. Why? The answer is sexual selection. Peahens find these large ornate tails to be extremely attractive, and the reason for this is because they are a display of strength. It's basically a signal saying, look at me, I can succeed despite this massive handicap. I can acquire all the territory and food necessary to grow the thing in the first place, and despite the fact that I can't fly as well as other males, despite the fact that I can't run as far or as fast and juke and jive like they can, I'm still here. So this intentional disability, this intentional handicap that these males are giving themselves is actually then the sign of their fitness. It's very counterintuitive, but this gives you an idea of the importance of sexual selection. So why am I talking about peacocks and comparing it to a paper about humans? Well, the answer is because there is a similar pattern of behavior observable in people. Now, the human mating game is considerably more complex than that of people, but the same strategy is deployed in humans to some degree. It's a pattern of sexual signal, and to explain this in a far more succinct way than I ever could, I'm going to briefly cede the floor to Dr. Garcia, Professor of Marketing and Consumption Behavior, and holder of the Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption, because I just want to know all about this.
Rappers are a representation of the type of sexual signaling. If you look at every rap video, there's always roughly the same one or more male rappers demonstrating that they have a whole bunch of high luxury items in front of them, fancy cars, fancy yachts, and they're always throwing money from the window, from the Ferrari, and so on. That throwing of the money is a type of signal called costly signaling in biology, right? So the peacock, in order to demonstrate that he's really fit, has to have a great business and tail so that the ladies can say, boy, this guy must really have good genes to be able to support such a costly tail. Same principle when it comes to throwing money. Boy, I must be really rich as a rapper to be able to, in a very cavalier manner, throw away thousands of dollars to the balcony of a Ferrari. Same principle.
Now, while rapping and hip-hop culture might be an extreme example of this particular kind of behavior, it is something that all men engage in to some degree. Indeed, this is why the entire economic principle of feathering goods exists. Feathering goods are part of a pattern of conspicuous consumption. Basically, it's buying things which are intentionally overpriced for their function. Things which are needlessly fancy, basically. So you could make clothes by sewing two rectangles of cloth together and cutting out leg, arms, and head holes. Basically, walk around wearing a pony's that. That's pretty much as simple as it gets. Or you can go further than that. You can shape and craft your garments, or even better, let your do it for you. And the more and more elaborate and costly these things are, the more that is associated with your social status. And this is a behavior that all humans engage in. The same thing applies to things like jewelry, expensive luxury wine, so on and so forth. And this is again all part of that status signal, which is a part of sexual signal. Women engage in these behaviors to get the acceptance and admiration of men and other women, and men engage in those behaviors for the same reasons, to get admiration and attention from women, and again, the admiration of men. So to finally bring us back around to this paper, I find it really odd that this author is just asserting that middle and upper-class men control the behavior of everyone. It completely removes from the equation the influence that women have on that process. And to this author, I would posit that actually women have more influence on this process than men do. Because when you consider these sorts of behaviors in animals, it is always the female that is the determining factor in what is acceptable. The males just ply themselves to one female. So I find the exclusion of all female agency in this to be a little bit weird, since it flies in the face of everything we know about animal behavior. So we reviewed the literature on traditional masculine norms in the United States. So they did a bit of background reading from all of these sources. Completely normal. Now comes the big part. Next, two focus groups consisting of both men and women who were masters and doctoral students in counseling psychology. Group 1 consisting of one Asian American man, one European American man, and two European American women. That's 4 people. Group 2, 2 European American men, 2 European American women, and 1 Haitian Canadian woman. That's 5 people. And they met with James R. Mahalik, who is the author of this paper, a European American man. These groups met every week for 90 minutes over an 8-month period to A. discuss the applicability of the norms identified in literature, B. refine the categories of the norms, and C. construct items to assess the continuum of conformity to the norm. For example, early in the process of measure construction, Mihalik asked the group to discuss their observations of whether males in the United States actually receive normative messages from the dominant culture that have been identified in the masculinity literature, e.g. to be successful. If there was agreement among group members that a norm was distinctly applicable to men, it was set aside for the next phase. However, if there was disagreement about whether a norm was distinctly applicable to men, it was revised. For example, in discussion, the norm to be successful, women in the focus groups reported they also received messages to be successful, felt pressure to be successful, and reported that this was true for most of their female friends. It was important that masculine norms identified through this process be distinct from feminine norms because Bem, 1981, noted that there are separate social gender schemas associated with masculinity versus femininity. Specifically, she observed that adults in the child's world rarely notice or remark upon how strong a little girl is becoming or how nurturing other boys is becoming, despite their readiness to note precisely these attributes in the, quote, appropriate sex, unquote. Thus, if a norm was seen as equally applicable to men and women, or was seen as very similar to another norm, e.g. success and performance accomplishment, the group members were given homework assignments to discuss these issues with friends and family. At the next meeting, the issues would be discussed and the idea around the norm refined until there was consensus that it reflected a masculine norm that was part of the cultural mainstream in US society. Continuing with the example above, after extensive discussion about the issues of success and accomplishment, women group members described that although they felt pressure to be successful, they did not experience expectations that they had to win at everything in which they were involved. However, male members of the focus group reported that winning was a very salient message for them and for their male friends and family, with people reporting it as a defining message for men found in the cultural mainstream. Thus, winning was identified as a masculine norm of interest for the measure. Okay, so let's begin picking this apart. So first of all, we have a group of 9 people who are the ones who are deciding what are masculine norms in society. First of all, these are 9 people who are doing masters or are doctoral students in counseling psychology. So for people who are curious to my content, they may remember a video I did not all that long ago, and this was a video where I looked through a paper which looked at the political orientation of people in the soft sciences, things like sociology and psychology. And this study found a very distinct left-leaning progressive bias, and that this is a bias that has only grown over time. And with that bias has come research bias in the fields of sociology and psychology, with certain ideas becoming accepted norms when there's actually very little evidence to support them. One such example that actually came in that paper was the use of stereotypes. It was generally considered in social sciences that stereotypes are completely inaccurate and unfair and should not be given any sort of weight or credence whatsoever. And this is in line with generally left-leaning and progressive ideology. However, an openly conservative psychologist entered the field, conducted their own experimentation, and then found that actually some stereotypes do come out for a reason, and that sometimes while they might be exaggerations, they tend to be informed by people's real-life experiences. So while some may be more inaccurate than others, the existence of a stereotype does have some degree of underlying truth, as opposed to being a complete and utter fabrication based on some sort of bigotry or prejudice. So the fact that all of these people who are inventing this scale share one particular profession, in this case they all work in the social sciences, I would say puts a very good chance that there is going to be some sort of bias in these results, since it's more likely that they probably share some degree of ideological overlap, and that will go very distinctly in one direction. And at no point in this paper is that something that's accounted for or attempted to be done. Furthermore, it's a group of 9 people, and it's basically 9 people examining their particular lives and saying, well, this is what I know has been expected of me in my life, and therefore this is typical of masculinity. And this scale is then just being produced by subjective consensus by this group, which means there doesn't necessarily have to be that much objective evidence for a particular point. It could quite easily just come down to how persuasive you are in group discussion in getting people to agree with you. Because once consensus has been met, that means that whatever you've agreed upon is now a masculine trait. I find the fact that they are creating a scale based on really nothing more than he said, she said, to be somewhat worrying. I'd like to bring up here the last part of that last paragraph that we looked at, talking about winning being a very salient message for the men and not so much for the women in the group. This is a pattern that could quite easily be explained by the individual choices of the people in the group. If all of the boys, when they were younger, engaged in sports and none of the girls did, then they may both be encouraged to succeed in life, but only one of those activities, the aim is to win. So the personal choices of these people could now then be being attempted to be twisted into a this is what society expects of masculinity. And again, there appears to be no attempt to control or even account for things like this, to even address that this could be a possibility. Now I know that some might say, oh well that's just proof that this is a masculine thing, that all of the boys played sport and none of the girls did. When you're dealing with a sample size of 9 people, this could just be a complete accident of selection. If you tried it with 10 random people off the street, you could end up with 5 men, all of whom are, say, dancers, singers, and painters, and a group of 5 women, all of whom are on a football team. And then that result would probably be completely switched around. Again, they've made no attempt to determine whether or not something like that has happened. Now, you might argue that, oh, well, they talked to their friends and family, that kind of stops this sort of thing from happening. Well, not really, because family shares a similar environment to you, generally, and a lot of your friends do as well. So it's quite possible that they will have the same basic biases as the people within the group. And I'm sure you get the idea of how potentially unreliable this is, so we'll move on. Using this process, we identified 12 masculine norms for the CMNI. These were labeled winning, emotional control, risk-taking, violence, dominance, playboy, self-reliance, policy of work, power over women, disdain for homosexuals, physical toughness, and pursuit of status. So let's talk about some of these traits that they've just decided are masculine. The first thing which I'd like to point out, and this is to reiterate a point that was made on the live stream, there is no comparative here for female traits. And by way of phrasing some of these, they must be male by default. For instance, playboy. No woman is going to admit to being a playboy or say that they are encouraged to be a playboy, because that is not a term that you would use for a pattern of behavior that a woman exhibits. If you took the trait playboy and translated it as being, say, sexually promiscuous, taking multiple partners, you would use different terminology for a woman. Some would call it being a slut, some would call it being sexually liberated. The very use of this language has made it a masculine trait when actually the pattern of behavior might not be. It's on the list as a point of semantics and nothing more. What's more unusual about the playboy trait is why exactly the author chose to use it. If you go back through his cited literature and the book that Malik himself attributes to this trait, it's a book by A.M. Harris written in 1995 titled Messages Men Hear Constructing Masculinities. When you look up what Harris was talking about when they wrote about playboy, you find that the author asserts that this is one of 4 roles under the category of men's ways of loving. The other 3 ways in which men love, according to this author, is by being a breadwinner, by being a faithful husband, and by being a nurturer. And if you continue reading on through the book, you find that 1% of men that author surveyed chose the playboy role as being the dominant role, which raises the very interesting question, why exactly did Malik pick something that only 1% of men surveyed said was relevant to them, and then try and say that this is the normalized pattern of behavior. Because on one hand you have 1%, on the other hand you have the norm. These two things are not synonyms. In fact, they're pretty much direct opposites to each other. Traits like power over women and violence. These are again difficult things to objectively quantify as being norms in US society. When you're constantly bombarded with messages like, it's never acceptable to hit a girl, it's difficult to see where this comes from. If you took violence in isolation, a common sense approach to this might be to say that, yeah, in a lot of cultures it's a masculine norm to use violence when necessary, say to protect yourself or to protect someone else who is in immediate danger. But it wouldn't be considered a very masculine trait if you just went around beating up people at random, especially if the target of that violence was a woman or a child. So this category is a monumental failure to define terms correctly. So if you were to answer yes to a hypothetical statement, would you, if necessary, take part in a fight in order to, say, protect a member of your family or one of your friends from attack, and you answer in the positive, you've been categorized as normative for violence, even though violence would actually then be an extreme outlier to your normative behavior. Consider now power over women as linked to pursuit of status. These two traits are potentially the same thing. If you pursue status and you reach high status, you would necessarily have power over other people because you would be wielding more social influence, and yet they decided to categorize it as power over women exclusively, as opposed to simply high status power over others. The language has been gendered when it doesn't need to. If they were to attempt to develop a scale of markers for women, they include power over men, whereas as we experienced earlier, basically completely ignores the concept of agency, so if you consider modern entertainment mediums, a very common message for women is that men are useless as there is a frequent portrayal of men basically overgrown children of competence, which would be women, and yet I can't help but think that that wouldn't be something that this is trust. And I'd like to back us up just a little bit to a slightly earlier stage in this thing's development, just to really question how accurate it is. You may remember that this was supposed to be looked at what I would like to do is look at another paper the development of unsurprisingly, it shares a great deal of problems it has with consisted of 32 units. consider some of the statements used to work themselves. I'm just putting them on the screen for you now. So if you have any questions, female sexual fidelity, or have sex if I was in a committed relationship, like a match. Again, it's basically the same statement. Just look at these statements, the questions that they're asking you'll notice basically the same, and yet in one case it's called gender, and in the other they're calling sexual fidelity. As I mentioned towards the beginning of this video, the language is loaded when they're defining the same characteristic. Has a much more negative connotation than the other. Sexual fidelity is the opposite of that. And yet, they say that points with their same questions and yet that describe the same pattern. While we're talking about loaded language, distinct shift of language over time. These papers are things which were signed in so if you look at some of the older papers, from the 1970s, there's some ways to find out an independent style of achievement. Restrictive or against anything feminine, achieving status, independence, self-confidence, and aggressiveness. So some of these sound a bit negative, some of them are a bit neutral, some of them sound positive. Again, from 1996, independent, assertive, strong, aggressive, some negative, some neutral, some positive. And you have to remember, around the 80s, there's the real big hit of feminism. That's when it changed. And then in 2003, this some negative, some neutral, some positive has descended into violence, power overwhelming, homosexual, risk-taking, pursuit of status, emotional control, playboy, self-reliance, primacy of work, and winning. The general shift in language is quite stark, moving from a fairly wide-ranging some negative positive to basically negative with a few that could be neutral. And I think that this really might be quite indicative of the overall cultural shift in social sciences that we've seen over the decades. So I'm going to bring this to an end and wrap this up. The development of the CNN scale is not very good. It is a very questionable metric to be using as a means of gathering any sort of data or doing any sort of analysis of any particular population. And this owes to the very questionable way in which it was produced. It's a scale that's supposed to be examining middle to upper class masculinity, which is then not masculinity as a whole. This comes about because of assert that behavior or majoritarily defined behavior are not gender capacity at all. They are related to each other. And compared to the conformity to feminine norms inventory, you find the exact same behavior being questioned, but then being titled a different thing. And it really does appear to be because of a pro-female anti-male bias. Stuff out of a lot of bad things, because all the problems in methodology in the dozen or so papers that the meta-analysis is constructed from, they get left in the individual papers and are never addressed by the meta-analysis, because the meta-analysis is just pulling the results out of those papers. If the results were gleaned from terrible methodology, then they're bad results. They're worthless. But the meta-analysis doesn't then make any allowance for that, because it's only looking at the results, drawing conclusions from those results. So I would say anyone who is using results from meta-analysis that was gathered from studies using the CMNI or even the CFNI is using some very questionable and potentially highly faulty data. And thus any conclusions drawn from said data is also very questionable, and frankly should probably be ignored until these problems with the actual CMNI are corrected, or a new scale that actually works is developed. Deal there. Let's talk about microaggressions and the distinct lack of evidence that there is to support them. So today I'm going to take us all on a magical and very lengthy journey through the paper Microaggressions, Strong Claims, Inadequate Evidence by Scott O'Liniford. There is going to be a lot of directly reading the study throughout this video, but I will be interspersing it with some of my own thoughts on the issue and bringing up some of the interesting evidence at the end. So I've got a lot to do, let's dive straight on in there, shall we, with the abstract. The microaggression concept has recently galvanized public discussion and spread to numerous college campuses and businesses. The author argues that the Microaggression Research Program, MRP, rests on 5 core premises, namely that microaggressions, 1, are operationalized with sufficient clarity and consensus to afford rigorous scientific investigation, 2, are interpreted negatively by most or all minority group members, 3, reflect implicitly prejudicial and implicitly aggressive motives, 4, can be validly assessed using only respondents' subjective reports, and 5, exert an adverse impact on recipients' mental health. A review of the literature reveals negligible support for all 5 suppositions. More broadly, the MRP has been marked by an absence of connectivity to key domains of psychological science, including psychometrics, social cognition, cognitive behavioral therapy, behavioral genetics, and personality, health, and industrial organizational psychology. Although the MRP has been fruitful in drawing the field's attention to subtle forms of prejudice, it is far too underdeveloped on the conceptual and methodological fronts to warrant real-world application. The author concludes with 18 suggestions for advancing the scientific status of the MRP, recommend abandonment of the term microaggression, and call for a moratorium on microaggression training programs and publicly distributed microaggression lists pending research to address the MRP's scientific limitations. So that's given you a brief overview of what it is that we're going to be looking at today, and it should sound a little bit familiar to anyone who has been following the concept of microaggressions over the last few years that it has been in the public discourse. And that's because it brings up in a nice formalized fashion various criticisms that I myself and many others have brought up around the topic over that time, namely the over-reliance on subjective interpretation of events, and as a result, a general lack of objective scientific standards for the topic. So with that out of the way, let's continue the reading. Despite impressive societal strides, racial prejudice remains an inescapable and deeply troubling reality of modern life. Although most survey data suggest that levels of overt, old-fashioned prejudice towards minorities in the United States have declined over the past several decades, pockets of such prejudice remain deeply entrenched. As recently as 2008, 4 to 6% of Americans acknowledged in a national poll that they would be unwilling to vote for any African American candidate as president. And this figure may be an underestimate given the social undesirability attached to admissions of racism. Now I'm going to jump on into a hilarious straw man argument. When we hear social justice terms take terms such as systemic or systematic racism, I still find it rather bizarre that to several people those two words sound completely interchangeable, but anyway, when the topic comes up and someone like myself comes along and dares to disagree and state, no, racism is not something inherent to the system, as you like to say. It's not even something that's prevalent amongst the system. It's something that is very small, it's something that's confined often to very small groups or to individuals in society. And the often heard rebuttal to that is something along the lines of, oh, so you think racism doesn't exist at all? You think it's impossible for anyone to be racist? Or some other such nonsense like that. When no such statement was made, the statement was that it is a very small number of people, often individuals, but possibly in small pockets. And this opening paragraph here somewhat highlights 4 to 6% of people in that survey just said, nope, we're not going to be voting for anyone who's an African American. Now, 4 to 6% is a very, very small number, and keep in mind that was a survey done in 2008. So this actually stands more in support of positions forwarded by someone like myself who says this is not a majority thing. This is not a systemic thing. It's not something that most people do. It is a small minority of people. And while, as this paragraph here does suggest, the number may be higher than 4 to 6%, there's no way of knowing whether it is or not. And this is something which is going to pop up a little bit later. I have no doubt that there are people who do have genuine racism because it is socially unacceptable to harbour racist views. However, when you start walking down the line of trying to address things which are not overt displays of a certain kind of behaviour, you start going down the roads of witch hunting and thoughtfulness. And that's something that's going to come up a little bit later in the study. Now we'll move on reading. Moreover, a growing cadre of scholars contends that in contemporary Western culture, prejudice often manifests in subtler forms than it did decades ago. In this perspective, prejudice has not genuinely become. It is merely become more indirect and insidious. Such underground incarnations of prejudice have gone by various names, each carrying somewhat different denotations and connotations that need not concern us here, including modern racism, colorblind racism, aversion racism, symbolic racism, and new racism. Research and theorizing on these overt variants of prejudice have spawned interest in the development of implicit prejudice measures, which are ostensibly more sensitive to subtle racial bias compared with traditional explicit measures of prejudice. Nevertheless, scientific status of implicit prejudice measures, such as the implicit association test, is controversial, with some scholars maintaining that they detect subtle forms of prejudice, but others contending that their validity is dubious. Just for the record, this is something which I have actually covered on this channel before, and I've gone so far as to demonstrate some of the various pitfalls that these sorts of tests actually hold, and have covered some of the interesting little mechanisms which are at work in them, and how in some cases the tests can actually cause the bias that they then report on, and how the idea of just telling someone that they are in part of a group can then result in them displaying a bias that they did not display previously. And that little point there about telling someone that they're in a group and then their behaviour adapting according to that information is something which we'll talk about a little bit later in this paper. The next section, Microaggressions, the Contemporary Context, is a couple of pages long, and I am going to be reading it all because it's really going to catch you up on what's been happening around microaggressions in recent times, and if it's not something you're familiar with, it should give you a pretty good understanding of what's going on. But I will be interspersing this with some examples of what the author is talking about, just to help break things up a little bit. So let's get to it. Enter microaggressions. Microaggressions are typically defined as simple snubs, slights, and insults directed toward minorities, as well as to women and other historically stigmatized groups that implicitly communicate masculine gender hostility. Compared with overtly prejudicial comments and acts, they are commonly understood to reflect less direct, although no less pernicious forms of racial comments. For example, in attempting to compliment an African American college student, a white professor might exclaim with surprise, "Wow, you are so articulate," presumably communicating implicitly that his African American undergraduate was well spoken. He would dispute that these remarks may be outset, one point racial and cultural insensitivities persist, including cancer. And what of them prejudice at times manifests itself in subtle and indirect ways that have until recently received psychological research. Just jumping in here, I am one of those people who would contend that this statement was something malicious, and I would also contend that it was callous, because as this paper mentions later, we're going to be talking about intent, and then you have to take into consideration the intent of the person making the statement. So would someone saying, "Wow, you're really articulate," necessarily be callous? It could be, but it doesn't. Considerable traction within this For example, Facebook page document instances of microaggressions and to demonstrate these comments violent and unsafe oriented into people's workplaces, homes, schools, childhood, adolescent development, and public transportation space environments. Quote, as of November 2016, the Google search for microaggression and its host variants was approximately 411,000 hits. Concept has also received considerable research support. Google store search from 2007 to the present reveals 2013. Over the past few years, the microaggression has also made its way to studies. With many institutions and seminars on microaggressions on how to identify statements that might cause effects. You may remember this particular doctor. Recognizing microaggressions. This was from the classroom and this was a doctor to give examples of what a microaggression was, and what the actual messages that they send. So, for example, is alien ones on one message that customer sending is, you are not a true American, and that you are an actual foreign even in your country. Of course, as we'll see going on with the study of these, this is somewhat nonsense to the actual study. On many campuses, schools, in some cases, demands from college students formally address faculty member, fellow student microaggressions on mentor. For example, in late 2015 at Emory University, a large student group from members of the university claimed that they claimed to 60% received instructed microaggressions through all undergraduate courses and graduates. According to the students, quote, these questions are widespread change in the culture of the college. Lives matter. Also affirm the broader ideals of social justice and we recognize that the structural racism and other forms of oppression of the college violate our commitment to equity and excellence in the educational programs for all students. We also acknowledge that our inaction as a faculty makes us complicit in the failures of the college to make our mission a living reality. For this, we apologize for failing you, our students. Most of the rest of the document is just a non-stop sound of self-flagellation, which sounds a little something like this. In recognition of the power imbalance between faculty and students, we will work in isolation with students and CDO to develop an effective mechanism for students to address and report microaggressions or other conflicts between students and faculty, to begin starting fall 2016. Faculty Council will put an interim policy in place by the start of the spring 2016 semester. So as you can see, colleges and universities are actively working on this. They are enacting policy changes based around the assertion of microaggressions. Back to the actual paper. Microaggressions have captured the interest of the business industry too. One estimate would place the cost of microaggressions to US workplace productivity at between 450 and 500 billion per year. In response to these figures and to broader concerns regarding the impact of microaggressions on workplace satisfaction, a number of major companies, including Coca-Cola and Facebook, have recently provided training to employees to detect and avoid implicitly prejudicial comments and actions, including microaggressions. Once again, this is just highlighting real-world change being made on something which currently doesn't have very much evidence to support it at all. All of these practical applications of the microaggression concept hinges on one overarching assumption that has gone largely unchallenged. Specifically, they presume that the microaggression research program has been subjected to and withstood rigorous scientific scrutiny. In this review, the author raises a variety of challenges to that presupposition and demonstrates that the scientific status of the MRP is far too preliminary to warrant its dissemination to real-world contexts. At the same time, the author argues that further scientific investigation of microaggressions is warranted, although such study will necessitate a large-scale modification to the MRP. In this review, the author refers to the MRP as the broad line of research focused on microaggressions and their potential impact on the behavior of recipients. And the author then delineates the MRP down to resting on 5 core assumptions. 1. Microaggressions are operationalized with sufficient clarity and consensus to afford rigorous scientific investigation. 2. Microaggressions are interpreted negatively by most or all minority group members. 3. Microaggressions reflect implicitly prejudicial and implicitly aggressive motives. 4. Microaggressions can be validly assessed using only respondents' subjective reports. And 5. Microaggressions exert an adverse impact on recipients' mental health. This author is hardly the first to raise questions regarding the uses and misuses of the microaggression concept. Over the past few years in particular, this concept has been the target of withering attacks from social critics, especially, although not exclusively, on the spectrum. These writers have raised legitimate concerns regarding the implications of the microaggression as well as of related concepts, such as trigger warnings and safe spaces on college and university campuses. In particular, critics have voiced apprehensions that an undue emphasis on microaggressions A. discourages or suppresses controversial or unpopular opinions, B. fosters a culture of political correctness, C. perpetuates a victim culture among aggrieved individuals, and D. contributes to, rather than ameliorates, racial tensions. Despite its increasing incursion into the popular landscape and its growing influence in scholarly circles, the conceptual and methodological status of the MRP has received scant scientific attention. Only 3 published reviews, 2 of them book chapters, have canvassed the state of the literature on the microaggression concept. All 3 reviews were broadly favourable to the MRP. In a brief review of the literature, Meyer and Williams 2010 focused primarily on qualitative research concerning microaggressions and offered useful suggestions for improving the methodology of such research, such as asking majority individuals to generate examples of potential microaggressions and extending the assessment of microaggressions beyond self-report indices. Nadal 2013 offered a brief summary of the history of the microaggression concept and the relevance of microaggressions to gay, lesbian, and transgendered individuals. In the most comprehensive review, Wrong, Durthik, David, Shaw, and Okaza 2014 examined 73 scholarly works on microaggressions, including qualitative and quantitative studies. They concluded that microaggression literature has borne witness to considerable scientific progress, but that further elaboration of the nature and scope of the microaggression concept is required. Wong et al. Argued that microaggression research should move beyond self-report measures and conduct more rigorous examinations of the potential effects of microaggressions on minority mental health. Nevertheless, none of these reviews challenged the central assumption that microaggressions, as currently conceptualized, compromise a psychologically meaningful construct. Nor did they examine in depth the empirical underpinnings of the MRP's forceful claims regarding a causal linkage between microaggressions and minority mental health. In this review, the author draws in part on these previous reviews, especially that of Wong et al., but goes well beyond them in providing a critical analysis of the conceptual coherence of the microaggression concept and the empirical support for its ostensibly psychological implications. In addition, the author offers constructive recommendations for advancing the MRP and caveats regarding its application to real-world contexts, especially microaggression training programs. Okay, so that was a lot to take in. But I really do consider that to have been essential reading, because I think it's given us a good foundational understanding of what microaggressions are, where they've come from, and the various problems that they're causing. And it's given us some tangible real-world examples of companies and colleges acting to deal with microaggressions on the idea that they are something that has been legitimately scientifically proven, when there's very little evidence actually supporting the link between the concept of microaggressions and the idea that they actually cause people to then have some sort of adverse reaction to them. So with all of that understanding out of the way, I'm now going to be able to pick out some of the more relevant and choice parts of this paper to read to you, rather than just continuing to barrel on through the whole thing. The next section, which is the goals of this review paper, can be nicely summed up more or less with this single paragraph. The author's review is placing particular emphasis on the extent to which the MRP fulfills several basic scientific criteria, specifically focusing on the logical clarity and coherence of the microaggression construct, reliability of microaggression measures, criterion-related validity of microaggression measures, incremental validity of microaggression measures, and beyond measures of overt prejudice. And then finally looking at the extent to which microaggression findings have been replicated across various information sources, especially among independent observers. And that last point about independent observers is rather important, because a microaggression is something that someone feels like it's happened to them, but an observer may not necessarily see the act of aggression happening, because it might not register to them, because it's not actually an act of aggression. And this is another point which is kind of important and really highlights the subjective nature of microaggressions, and also helps to highlight the general lack of consensus that there is about what exactly a microaggression is. Up next, there is a section about the history of microaggressions, but that's not really relevant for what we're going to be talking about in this video, but it's an interesting read if you'd want to go and check it out in your own time. So we're going to move on to the section, the conceptualization of microaggressions, and the first point here is very important, and that is that microaggressions are an open concept. Microaggressions, like most and perhaps virtually all psychological constructs such as intelligence, extroversion, and schizophrenia, is an open concept. Open concepts are characterized by A, intrinsically fuzzy boundaries, B, an indefinitely extendable list of indicators, and C, an unclear inner nature. So it's important to note here, as the author does in this next paragraph, this isn't inherently a bad thing. A lot of scientific knowledge starts as an open idea, a kind of fuzzy, kind of, sort of, could've, would've set of observations that become less and less open as you narrow down what exactly it is that you're looking at. Indeed, even things like the concept of DNA and what exactly is a gene started very, very open, but became more and more closed off as we started to learn more about them. Microaggressions, however, haven't reached that stage yet, and it's still very dubious whether or not its definition is sufficiently clear. For example, it's not evident which kind of actions constitute verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignity, nor what approximate severity of indignity is necessary for an action to constitute a microaggression. A reference to Sue et al. In 2007 and also 2010A, microaggressions lie in the eye of the beholder. And this is a very important phrase because this makes it very difficult to work out whether or not you can actually call something aggressive. The example sentence given here is someone stating to a minority group person, "I realize you didn't have the same educational opportunities as most whites, so I can understand why the first year of college has been challenging for you." Now, one potential interpretation of that is that it is a patronizing form of indirect hostility, basically saying, you suck and you're not as good as everyone else. Of course, another person might interpret it as a very helpful and supportive statement to make, saying, look, circumstances were against you, but you can overcome them and let's go do it. So as you can see, the individual reading of a sentence is very, very important. This eye of the beholder and subjective reading on sentences throws up a lot of questions about how exactly objective a microaggression can be, since it seems to largely rely on some sort of group consensus about whether or not a microaggression has happened. But once again, there's no objective standard as to how much of a consensus you need in order to dictate whether or not it has happened. So while you can see microaggressions are an open concept, the problem is they are too open. The boundaries around it is too fuzzy. Having something solid to hang your hat on is always useful, but in social sciences like this, it's not always possible. But you always at least know the kind of general area that you can throw your hat. It's like throwing it into a ring instead of hanging it on a peg. The problem with microaggressions is there is no peg, there is no ring. You're just kind of throwing hats all around the place and hoping that wherever your hat lands, someone else also agrees that it landed there, because then you might be able to make some sort of statement. It's far too wishy-washy in its current incarnation. As this paper even notes, and as some of us have experienced in real life, there are certain topics which are now deemed as offensive and as causing microaggressions, even though they're looking at objectively scientifically sound topics, such as discussing of racial differences around intelligence and mental illness. Even talking about things such as biological sex differences in brains from male to female anatomy and the varying ratios of things like grey and white matter, and how there is a pretty distinct difference between the sexes. Even just having these conversations and doing these studies is rapidly becoming forbidden because of the concept of things like microaggressions. And then, by extension, some people will just outright declare that these topics are racist or sexist, even though it is just observing something which is objectively there. And of course, adding to this is the problem of hindsight. Looking back on things can change the light in which people see things. And there's also the possibility of talking to people and then retroactively changing your opinion on a past event based on what someone tells you in the future. And this paper has a nice little example of this, which I'm going to read to you because it's referenced later as well. Fueling concerns regarding the fluid boundaries of the microaggression concept is the fact that, in hindsight, even statements that might appear to be explicitly anti-prejudiced have been interpreted by some MRP advocates as microaggressions. A telling example comes from Sue 2010B, who analyzed Arizona Senator and then presidential candidate John McCain's response to an elderly woman during a 2008 campaign stop. The woman stated, "I can't trust Obama, he's an Arab," and McCain immediately grabbed the microphone to correct her. No, ma'am, McCain retorted. He's a decent family man and citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with. While acknowledging that McCain's defense of Obama was well-intentioned, Sue dubbed it a major microaggression. According to Sue, McCain's assertion that Obama is a decent family man implicitly communicated the message that most Muslim males are not decent family men, as well as the message that were Obama in fact a Muslim, which he is not, it would have implied that he was something dangerous, or at least unworthy of admiration. Although these post hoc interpretations of McCain's comments are interesting and might be defensible, in particular, they raise the possibility that a vast number of statements can be labeled retrospectively as microaggressions. For example, had McCain responded, "No, ma'am, he's not an Arab," or "What would be wrong if he were?" which is the response Sue insisted McCain should have given. Some MRP proponents could have contended that McCain was subtly intending to insinuate that Obama might indeed be a Muslim. Furthermore, Sue's interpretation overlooks the more parsimonious possibility that McCain was responding to the effective gist of the woman's comment, namely that Obama is a bad and untrustworthy person, rather than to its literal content. In doing so, he effectively communicated his central point, namely that although he disagreed with Obama on many things, he did not believe that Obama was trying to conceal or lie about his ancestry, or that Obama was a bad person. I really like this example because it highlights how different readings of one sentence can massively change its meaning. And this really highlights how it goes down to individual interpretation. And also, because this is politically slanted, it throws up the possibility of charitable interpretations. And if you are politically opposed to someone, you might be more inclined to give them the less charitable interpretation. Because of course, once you've decided you don't like someone, it's much easier to justify taking what they've said in the worst possible light, because it fits your worldview of how you think that person must be. On the topic of ambiguity, most proponents of the MRP acknowledge microaggressions, especially so-called micro-insights and micro-observations, are often or usually extremely ambiguous in nature, rendering it difficult to, or even impossible, to ascertain whether they have actually occurred. This paper then gives several examples to illustrate the point, but I'll just give you two here. The person is thrown into a very confusing and ambiguous situation, making it difficult to conclude whether an offense has occurred. Many racial microaggressions are so subtle that neither the target nor perpetrator may entirely understand what is happening. So this is interesting because this is scholars talking about microaggressions, people who are in favor of microaggressions, actually stating they have no idea what they are and no idea when they happen. And yet they do expect people to take this topic seriously. And this sort of admission really should be setting off alarm bells for people in light of what we saw earlier in this paper, where corporations and colleges are enacting changes in their policies based on this non-existent science. Of course, a little bit of ambiguity isn't actually necessarily a bad thing. In some cases, it does allow you to gain a little bit of insight into the person who is telling you about the experience. But, in the case of microaggressions, stimulus ambiguity may, paradoxically, as this paper notes, open the floodgates for respondents' personality traits such as negative emotionality to colour their interpretation of items. Surprisingly, this vexing possibility has received little or no attention in the microaggression literature. Given the importance of this issue for evaluating the construct validity of microaggression measures, the author visits this later in the paper, in the section The Largely Neglected Role of Personality Traits. The next section is about embedded political values, and is somewhat self-explanatory, but is also a section which I'm going to keep very, very brief, because the very first citation for this, Duarte et al. 2015, which was a paper which reported on the problems of embedded values in the social sciences and how they were pretty much progressively slanted. And the reason I'm not really going to touch this part of the paper is because the citation here, Duarte et al., is a paper which I've already done a video about, called Teal Deer Progressive Academic Echo Chambers, and that video goes into the values in social sciences, and gives examples of times that value judgments have crept into the social sciences and basically become true dispelled when someone of a political bent which is not progressive left-leaning comes in and starts questioning those values. The next section is quite interesting and can really be covered in brief. It's titled, What's in a Name? The very name microaggression implies that the statements or actions that fall under this label are aggressive in nature. Yet confusingly, MRP advocates posit that such behaviours are typically unintentional. This is quite important because the term microaggression is somewhat an oxymoron by definition. As this paper points out, the very term aggression by definition would be any form of behaviour directed towards the goal of harming or injuring another living being who is motivated to avoid such treatment. Thus, the idea of accidental aggression makes very little sense. And this paper then goes on to point out that this may actually cause problems, because consistent with findings from other studies, if people perceive an act as being aggressive, they are more likely to respond with aggression. And labeling people who deliver microaggressions as perpetrators may contribute to the same kind of behavior. And thus, using these words around these actions might be encouraging people to feel as if they're being victimized, to feel as if they're being aggressed against when they're not. Then there's the final problem here, and this is micro or macro. And it's another issue of language, and rather interestingly, a problem of mission creep. The prefix micro in microaggression implies that the transgression in microaggressive actions are barely visible or at least challenging to detect. This indeed seems to be the case for many micro-assaults and micro-invalidations, yet for a number of purported microaggressions, especially micro-assaults, this assumption is dubious. In particular, many or most micro-assaults appear to be emblematic of traditional, old-fashioned racism. For example, according to one author team, a micro-assault may include calling a woman a bitch or a whore. Another group of authors stated regarding referring to an Asian American as a Jap or a chink, explicitly discouraging one's child from dating an Asian American, or publicly displaying blatant caricatures of Asians, such as pictures of individuals described as micro-assaults. So I'm sure you can see the problem. These may be very blatant and overt signs of racism and sexism. Circumstance is important, and they might not be. But making the assumption that they absolutely definitely are, there is nothing micro about any of these actions. And thus, this is then scholars using large, very obvious, overt forms of racism and sexism to prop up the concept of microaggressions, which is pretty obviously ridiculous. Another major flaw of the MRP is its focus group methodology. This methodology and its problems should be familiar to people who follow this channel, since it's one which has cropped up before in the CMNI video. Basically, in order to come up with a list of things which were deemed to be microaggressions, researchers get together a group of people to have a chat with about what is considered microaggressions and then get their opinions on them. The problem is, part of the sampling method used selected minority student participants who had to agree that subtle racism and discrimination exist in the United States. So they started from a base point with a group of people who kind of already agreed with the concept to start with. A similar case happened in a different group of researchers when they did a similar thing with a group of African American faculty members in counseling psychology and various counseling programs, all of whom acknowledged that subtle racism continues to exist in the US society and reported personal experiences with subtle forms of racism in America. Moreover, given that leaders of these focus groups were aware that their goal was to elicit examples of microaggressions, group participants may have experienced pronounced demand characteristics to interpret ambiguous racial statements as microaggressive. In some studies, these demand characteristics appear to have even been made explicit. For example, in Constantine et al. 2008, interviewers provided participants with a definition of racial microaggressions and, quote, confirmed that the interviews were intended to focus on sexual experiences of subtle racism, such as racial microaggressions in the quote. Essentially, this isolating this problem. is that in most or all studies, team leaders have been selected on the basis of their acceptance of the core premises of the MRP. For example, Su et al. 2009 acknowledged that, quote, team members believe that subtle racism exists, that it occurs against Asian Americans, that it possesses detrimental psychological consequences, and that it may be ethnic group specific, end quote. So when it came to constructing the MRP, you can see there was very much kind of an already accepted idea that this was a thing. And I think this plays directly into what is covered in my videos talking about progressive academic echo chambers, and how there are certain ideas that are basically just acceptable when there's very little evidence to support them. And then, in this case, these grand conspiracies get woven around these accepted ideas, even though there is very little, or in some cases, no scientific evidence to back them up. They are merely an assertion that everyone agrees with. A further problem that a lot of these microaggression studies and questionnaires fall into is a lack of knowledge of events base rates. This chapter can be best summarized as when researchers ask questions of people, such as, someone tells you you are too loud and should call police, and you are ignored at a store counter as attention is given to a customer who is of a different ethnic group that is behind you. These things are listed as microaggressions. However, they never ascertain a baseline for the person experiencing these events, so it can never be known if these so-called microaggressions that this person is experiencing are any higher or lower than at any other time in their life, or are any higher or lower than experiences that everyone else is having. It is just assumed that because they are reporting this, that these are unique events happening to them when there is no evidence to support this. Mono-source bias is perhaps the most conspicuous limitation of the exclusive reliance on self-reporting indices in the MRP. This section here is best summed up as follows. There's a very important thing in psychology called critical multiplism. Critical multiplism basically means trying to find the same thing from lots of different methodological vantage points. So if you're trying to find something out, giving a bunch of people questionnaires where they self-report stuff is one vantage point, but then having someone else observe what people are doing and take notes on what's happening would be another vantage point. And then you can take those two sources of data, cross-reference them, and see if there's any correlation between the two. The MRP derives all of its data from one source, which has the potential of biasing. Monosource bias. As this paper even says, monosource bias renders it difficult or impossible to evaluate the extent to which MRP findings are robust across different informants, including observers. And that ties back very nicely to what was mentioned earlier about witnesses to situations where microaggressions are faced. Because obviously if you took two sources of information, the self-reporting of one person and the observation done by another person, and you put those two bits of information together, you could quite easily find no correlation whatsoever, as the self-reporting person says they experienced a microaggression, but the observer doesn't think a microaggression happened, or it could be the other way around. As this paper does mention, one study did get around that by using observers, but in that study they did not assess participants' mental health outcomes, which invalidates it for then linking microaggressions to mental health problems, which is one of the main points that I'm sure you remember that microaggressions actually cause people to then experience problems. The MRP also suffers from a severe lack of causal linking. Numerous studies have revealed robust correlations between microaggressions and adverse mental health outcomes, such as psychological distress, anxiety, and depression among minorities. Many MRP advocates have invoked these findings to advance forceful, if not definitive, claims concerning the causal impact of microaggressions on psychological disturbance. Some MRP advocates have even gone so far as to state that cumulative effects of microaggressions shorten life expectancy and foster suicidal thoughts. However, these assertions are totally unqualified. There is an absolute dearth of longitudinal data linking microaggressions to such outcomes. To use the good old meme that is very relevant here, correlation does not equal causation. They have some instances of correlation, but they have absolutely no causal link. And now a big one, which is a good 4 pages of information, but I'm going to try and condense it as best I can. the largely neglected role of personality traits. One personality trait that the MRP has totally ignored is the concept of negative emotionality. People who score high in negative emotionality in testing have a temperamental disposition to experience aversive emotions of many kinds, including anxiety, worry, moodiness, guilt, shame, irritability, and perceived victimization. And this is very important because some of the studies done around microaggressions have found that in some cases quite large numbers of their test subjects did not experience microaggressions at all. And with no sort of testing or control done accounting for the personality traits of those responding to these questionnaires, they have no way of knowing whether or not these people claiming that they are being microaggressed simply see the world in a generally more negative way than those who don't experience microaggressions. At which point they are not microaggressions at all, but simply indicative of the subject's general personality and view of the world. And this is quite interesting because personality is one of those things in life that's actually partially heritable. It's partly genetic. But as we know, there is a distinct bias in the social sciences against things like genetic behaviors. There tends to be a lot more focus on the idea that everything is socialized. But back onto the point of negative emotions, and how the MRP has made no allowance for them, it's kind of a double whammy problem. First of all, they may be sampling people who are simply more predisposed towards finding everything in the world problematic, but then they ask them to rate how much these supposed negative interactions have affected them. And of course, if they have an overall negative worldview, they're going to over-exaggerate or overstate the negative effect that it's had on them. Now, this is not to say that it hasn't had a negative effect, which might possibly have done so, but it ends up double reporting someone who is overly sensitive to this sort of thing. To begin winding things down, we're going to have a look at the section taking stock of the scientific status of the MRP, which I'm just going to read in its entirety, since it's a rather nice overview of what we're talking about. As noted earlier, the MRP appears to hinge on 5 key premises, and those are worth revisiting in light of the research that the reviewer has looked at. The first point was microaggressions operationalized with sufficient clarity and consensus to afford rigorous scientific investigation. The support for this assertion is at best further. The boundaries of the microaggression concept are at present so enormous that an enormous array of behaviors on the part of the majority of individuals, many of them can be subsumed under the expansive microaggression umbrella. As a consequence, the false positive rates of current microaggression lists may be substantial and remain unknown. Moreover, some microaggressions identified are largely contradictory because there are no better reliability data on whether recipients of microaggressions agree on which individuals the extent to which microaggressions is also unknown. In some, the presumed microaggressions that are widely accepted in may be indefinite limits. Prejudice. B. Well-intentioned statements. C. Culturally insensitive faux pas that do not reflect implicit prejudice. And D. Entirely misinterpreted consequences. The MRP all concerted efforts to pass this potential heterogeneity using multi-method approaches and multi-factor analysis. 2. Microaggressions are interpreted negatively by most or all members. There is no systematic research support for this hypothesis. Furthermore, it is prima facie implausible that the case of all microaggressions, but this assertion lies in the face of some forms of research in social therapy. It also runs against the grain of contemporary which posit that reactions to potential stressors are influenced by specifically the largely overlooks the possibility that individuals current recipients' interpretation of reactions to microaggressions. 3. Microaggressions reflect implicitly prejudicial and implicitly aggressive motives. there is no research support for this assertion. Specifically, there is no evidence that microaggressions are correlated with indicators of either prejudice or aggression in individuals. 4. Microaggressions can be validly assessed using only respondent subjective reports. The mono-source bias that is carried by the MRP has hampered the field evaluation of the robustness of the MRP and its generalizability across multiple respondents. The MRP's virtually exclusive reliance on self-reported microaggressions also make it impossible to exclude the possibility that individual differences in the subjective appraisal of microaggressions in part reflect stable individual differences in personality. 5. Microaggressions exert an adverse impact on the mental health of recipients. There is minimal research evidence for this assertion, and the unqualified causal claims of the MRP proponents are insufficiently justified. Furthermore, the MRP's nearly wholesale neglect of personality traits, especially NE, renders it difficult or impossible to rule out the possibility that some of the association between microaggressions and mental outcomes is attributed to the contaminating influence of personality. The marked ambiguity of microaggressions leaves considerable room for interpretations of and reactions to them to be shaped by recipients' personality traits. These same traits also boost individuals' risk of adverse mental outcomes. As it presently stands, the MRP demonstrates only that certain individuals report consistently experiencing a high frequency of prejudicial comments and actions, while these individuals also consistently report psychological distress. To close us out, the author then gives 18 recommendations so that it could potentially become a tool that is useful rather than merely a by circuits. 1. Provide a clearer operationalization of microaggressions, with a particular focus on which actions and statements do not fall under the microaggression umbrella. 2. Examine the interparty reliability of judgments of microaggressions, especially the extent to which recipients and observers agree on which actions and statements reflect implicitly prejudicial actions on the part of deliverers. 3. Examine the interparty reliability of implicit messages associated with microaggressions among minority individuals. 4. Avoid the problem of embedded political values. Enlist collaborators who do not necessarily share the core assumptions of the microaggression research program, such as that subtle racism is pervasive in the US society. 5. Examine the correlations between overall microaggressions and indices of prejudice and aggression. 6. Abandon the term of microaggression and substitute an alternative term that does not imply that the deliverer statement is aggressive and extremely subtle. 7. When developing microaggression measures, adopt a self-correcting, iterative approach to test construction. 8. When generating microaggression items, use focus group members and other individuals drawn from a wide variety of ideological perspectives, including individuals who do not necessarily perceive sexual prejudice as a serious problem in US society. 9. Ensure that microaggression items contain sufficient situational context to minimize ambiguity in their interpretation. 10. Ascertain the approximate rate of events, example, receiving poor service at restaurants, that are referenced in many microaggression items. 11. Expand the microaggression research program to include alternative sources of assessment in addition to self-report, especially reports from independent observers. 12. Avoid strong assertions regarding the causal relation between microaggressions and adverse mental outcomes. 14. Conduct further longitudinal studies concerning the relation between microaggressions and adverse mental outcomes. 14. Include measures of negative emotional learning, especially those that assess the perception of oneself as a victim and hostile attribution bias in studies of microaggressions. 15. Use microaggression measures that do not confound the experience of microaggression experiences with the subjective distress associated with these experiences. 16. Findings examining the correlation between microaggressions and adverse mental health outcomes are controlling measures of negative personality. 17. Examine the behaviors and personality characteristics of microaggression deliverers as well as microaggression. And finally, 18, examine the incremental validity of microaggressions above and beyond overtly prejudicial statements and actions for statistically predictive adverse mental outcomes. So, all of that out of the way, I don't particularly have any strong closing thoughts on this. This paper is very self-explanatory and has really just formalized a lot of the criticisms that people have been leveling at the content of microaggressions for years, and for that I applaud and thank the author, because the entire concept of microaggressions, much like the implicit association tests, in their current forms are really not worth very much and are too frequently being used and abused as if they are some sort of scientific authority on anything. They are not. The most worrying of all about these microaggressions is that we're seeing policy changes being enacted by companies and colleges, and in some cases governments, based on what can only really be called pseudoscience. The male concept jab, by far the most requested thing over the past week or so, and I can completely understand why. There has been a lot of publicity around this. All of it has been wrong, and that statement applies to pretty much every side of this. The general mainstream media has taken the findings of this paper and blown it out of all proportion, and applied levels of agency to the test subjects that they simply don't have in regards to how a clinical trial is run, and then often misinterpreting the results and the findings. And then we have people from the self-proclaimed rationalist side of the spectrum on the internets. You know, those people who are all about the evidence and the research and the logics and the reason, making statements about this paper which are factually inaccurate and in some cases completely disproven or entirely contradicted by the actual paper. So today, in this video, we're going to be breaking this down into a nice, delightful little two-parter. The first half of this video, we're going to be looking at the actual research, so that you have a good, solid understanding of what is actually going on here. And then we're going to look at some of the hilarious media backlash to it. Okay? Okay. Let's do this. Efficacy and safety of an injectable combination hormonal contraceptive for men, by all of these people. Fortunately, this being a fairly standard paper, it contains a very convenient TLDR, so we're going to read that, and then I'll take you through the more choice and important parts of the actual paper itself. Context: the development of a safe and effective reversible method of male contraception is still an unmet need. The objective is the evaluation of suppression of spermatogenesis and contraceptive protection by co-administered injections of progestogen and testosterone. The design and setting is a prospective multi-center study across 10 study centers. Participants in this study are all healthy men aged 18 to 45 and their 18 to 38-year-old female partners, both of whom have no known fertility problems. Intervention, which is how the drug is being administered in this case, is an intramuscular injection of 200 mg norethisterone enanthate combined with 1,000 mg testosterone undecanoate, administered every 8 weeks. Main outcome measures are the suppression of spermatogenesis by ejaculate analysis and contraceptive protection by pregnancy rate, basically counting sperm and seeing how many people got pregnant. A quick look at the results shows us that of 320 participants, 95.9 of the 100 continuing users were suppressed to a sperm concentration less than or equal to 1 million per milliliter within 24 weeks. During the efficacy phase of up to 56 weeks, 4 pregnancies did occur among the partners of 226 male participants, with the rate of 1.57 per 100 continuing users. The cumulative reversibility of suppression of spermatogenesis after 52 weeks of recovery was 94.8%. The most common adverse effects experienced were acne, injection site pain, increased libido, and mood disorders. Following the recommendations of an external safety review committee, the recruitment and hormone injections were terminated early.